You're listening to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda. On this episode, we are discussing Note to Self, track number 1 on 2012's Failed States LP. This is our 10th Failed States episode.
Woohoo!
And as our faithful listeners might recall, this happens to be my favorite propaganda album and probably my favorite album, full stop.
Amazing. Nice.
And, and since I enjoy doing a scan of old album reviews from around the release dates, it's funny to see, not funny, but interesting to see what music writers were saying about the album when it came out.
Mm-hmm.
I found a really neat one in a 2012 review by Craig Hayes posted on the website Pop Matters. The mention of Note to Self reads, opener Note to Self flawlessly encapsulates propaganda's fusion of thrash and melodic and hard-edged punk with cutting social personal commentary, with a slow build intro and manic rhythmic variations. It's a perfect representation of where the band sits sonically in 2012. Progressive, propulsive, and unafraid to drop in plenty of peculiarities. From there on in, things only get more aggressive and pointed as vocalist, guitarist Chris Hanna, guitarist, vocalist David Gillis, bassist, vocalist Todd Kowalski, and drummer, vocalist George Samoleski produced the band's most unforgiving and unflinching album.
I agree.
Yeah, what a great summary of perhaps I think the most unique propaganda opening track.
Yeah, I think that you might have some argument there with that song, maybe in competition with Night Letters and maybe Mate Ka, but this is definitely such a unique standalone track within this band's discography. And I just got back from seeing 3 shows in Ontario on the spring 2022 tour. And I don't know if they played this all 3 nights, but they played it at least twice. So I saw this song a lot. So this is a heavy rotation live track to this day. And I was thinking back, whenever I saw your notes about the review from around the time of the release, I was thinking about how I felt about this record when it first came out. And the shock I felt with this as the opener, it took a long time for me to process.
Yeah.
I wasn't ready for the guitar riff and beat that would, sound at home on a track next to Jailbreak by Thin Lizzy. It shook me because I was waiting for Night Letters or supporting cast style material part 2. And I have to admit that I didn't really get this song when it came out, because it's a track that asks for your attention over a long period of time, which is not something I was super used to with this band. But I listened to it, 50 times, of course, when it came out. But it wasn't the stampeding rager I had come to know from Night Letters, Speculative Fiction, Mate Ka, Marisa Kun, Rasa Khan. But I tell you what, when I saw Propaganda open with Note to Self on November 4th, 2012 at the Firebird in St. Louis, Missouri, I got it. That's why I think I now appreciate Victory Lap far more than just a couple of years ago, after seeing them play a whole bunch of songs off that in Winnipeg and Ontario recently this past 6 months. But this band throws me for a loop seeing them live, which makes these songs, which, make me work as a listener. It makes it all sink in. And, I think about the transition as well from record to record. I'm always thinking about the last song on a record and the first song on the next record. And I have this habit with Propaganda where I listen when a new record comes out, I'll go back and I'll listen to the last song on the previous record, and then I'll start the new record. So the transitions, if you think about those ending tracks and opening tracks from record to record, it's really fascinating stuff. So you think about going from Refusing to Be a Man as the last track on Less Talk to Mate Ka on Today's Empires, huge transition sonically. And this got me thinking of how Last Will and Testament, with its long and also brooding intro into Note to Self, really makes a lot of sense stylistically, compared to where Refusing to Be a Man and Mate Ka are very detached as a closer and an opener. And this makes me think of how the band sits on riffs for sometimes years to come. But I wonder if there's any overlap of Last Will and Testament and Note to Self, because if you put them back to back on a playlist and go directly from the outro of Note to Self directly into the intro of Last Will directly into the intro of Note to Self, they work together musically. And if you let Last Will ring out to about 6 minutes in that song and then immediately click over to Note to Self, it's so unbelievably beautiful and smooth of a transition. And it's the perfect departure point from supporting cast into Failed States. And I have to speculate that they realized how good this was going to be for any listener who made the connection between the end of the 2009 record and the 2012 record. So to me, like, this one just leads right into where supporting cast left off. I mean, it's really striking if you go listen to Last Will into Note to Self back to back. And those are my general thoughts about this as the opener. And I'm wondering how you felt as this is the opener, because this was a really unique way to open this record.
Well, Greg, first I'll say I really like that description, because I think as a whole, supporting cast feels very, like, as an album, it feels disconnected from Failed States and from Note to Self. But if you zero in on the end and the beginning, that's a far more, there's a ton of overlap there that I really don't think I had considered until now. And I probably saw it more in terms of the overall difference between, that record and this single song. And I'm pretty sure it was the first track I heard. If there was like a teaser trailer or a lyric video that had that Hedges quote, like I seem to remember that, but I couldn't really find anything if there was something that was released before the actual album came out. But I remember thinking, like, oh boy, they sure are doing something different here. And hearing the song as an ambitious and unique extension of what they had already done, with probably, I would say, at least a pang of disappointment that it sounded so different.
I'm with you on that.
Like, reflecting on my own obsession with supporting cast.
Yeah.
It is not like a shift, not only in style, but also sequencing in an album. Since it's such a huge, slow build, that's considerably different from every other record up to this point. So, like, I also don't begrudge anyone who, like, first heard this and was like, wait, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
I mean, despite it being remarkably technical and, the lyrics are both like poignant and acrimonious. I definitely had kind of a, whoa, what's going on here?
Exactly.
Sort of response that, at first I was very disappointed with Failed States for the first couple weeks. And then if I just kept listening, or if it was when I finally, I don't actually think I saw him live on this record till 2014.
Yeah.
So, it grew on me pretty quickly, but my first impression of it was, I don't know about this one.
Yeah, because you think about, to me, like, supporting cast is just unimpeachable music, essentially. Like, to this day, I can't find anything about that record that I don't love. And this one was way more work. And, I think of this song, if they recorded it, like, this could also be an album closer. If you think about that long intro to Last Will and Testament, this one feels like that. So they chose to close the previous record with a song that's like this one in a way. And they could have closed this record with this one too. But duplicate keys a caro, of course. So, it's just kind of it's a wild thought experiment to think about listening for me to Last Will and Testament and then skipping right over into Note to Self. And it just has stuck with me ever since I discovered the way that if you listen to Last Will up to about 6 minutes and then you hit skip into Note to Self immediately, how smooth that transition was. But I felt that the disappointment also, like, I'm copping to that here, because it feels like almost like a dirty thing to say, because Note to Self is such an amazing song. Right. But, like, I didn't get this song until I saw it live. And then when I saw him play it, I was pressed right against the stage in St. Louis. And I was like, oh, okay, now I get it. So that's what I needed. I needed that live experience. So, but that's what happened with Victory Lap too. I needed to see those songs live, and then I was like, all right, now I really, really get it. And we've been making the podcast for a long time before I saw those Victory Lap songs live. So making the podcast really opened me up to Victory Lap. Because we were assessing them so deeply, but I wouldn't have gotten those songs like fully had I not gone and started seeing them live again in the last 6 months. So anyway, those are just some of my opening ramblings and raves since I haven't talked to you in a couple of months. But let's what do you think we should move on to?
Well, we talked a little bit about the music. We don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but I do know that, Greg, you have a cover that you're going to tell us about.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay. So this has been in the can for a while. And people may have heard the Ego Sum Papa episode that I made recently. And I got some great covers for that episode. So if you haven't heard that Ego Sum Papa, there's 4 fabulous covers in that episode. But this is another ukulele cover from our friend of the pod, Jason Hatcher. And I asked Jason to comment on his ukulele cover. And he said, I've covered a lot of songs on ukulele in my youth, sometimes playing propaganda, no effects against me, and more between hardcore bands at shows. I've covered Millen Collins' Life on a Plate, Vandals' Live Fast Diarrhea, and No Effects' Punk and Drublic from start to finish. The lyrics hit me hard as I too find myself sitting in this apathetic state, expecting things to get better without doing anything myself. Now, as a father of 2, I have a legacy to uphold and make a better world for them. So those are some of Jason's thoughts that he wanted to put in before leading into his ukulele cover of Note to Self. So what a project, you know what I mean? Playing Note to Self on a ukulele. So hats off to Jason Hatcher, and I hope you enjoy this very unique cover of this very special propaganda song. right. So thank you to Jason Hatcher. Jason did 2 ukulele covers of Ego Sum Papa as well in 2 different musical styles. So it's awesome to have Jason's contribution again so quickly on this Note to Self episode. So hats off to Jason for that one.
All right, Greg. Well, let's get to our guest segment. Who did you interview for Note to Self?
Okay, so our friend, my friend, Kashif Shaikh is here, and Kashif is a super fantastic friend of mine now. He has been, in contact with me about propaganda for the last couple of years, as so many people have been. And Kashif and I got to know each other, and I found out that he is the co-founder and president of something called the Pillars Fund. And in 2010, Kashif and a small group of Muslim philanthropists founded Pillars to strategically organize wealth within their communities and support American Muslim civic institutions and leaders building a more just and equitable society. So, Kashif also volunteered his time and resources to grow and lead Pillars for a long time. And in 2016, he was Pillars' first full-time director. And under his leadership, this Pillars Fund has invested more than $7 million in Muslim community organizations and initiatives. And he's become kind of like a leading voice for Muslim creativity in the United States. And Kashif and I recorded this a while back, and I also had him as a guest on my other podcast, Classical Ideas. So I interviewed Kashif fully about his work within like Muslim creatives and the scene that he's a part of. And he's on episode 209 of Classical Ideas. And I interviewed him a ton about his professional work. So if you like what he has to say here, kind of like previewing what some of his work is like, then go check him out on 209 of Classical Ideas. But it's really awesome getting to know Kashif because he does so much. He's involved in so much activism and he's so visible. And whenever we get to chatting about songs, he's like, I connect so deeply to Note to Self. So it was really great to hear how this particular tune connects with his own life experiences. So I was delighted to have him on the show to talk about propaganda, his love of the band, and his love of the song Note to Self. So please enjoy my conversation with Kashif Shaikh. Kashif Shaikh, welcome to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda.
Thank you so much for having me, Greg.
I am delighted you're here. So we've been communicating for months and months and about having you on the show to be a guest. And I'm really delighted that we were finally able to make it work. And I'm wondering if we can just start off by having you introduce yourself a little bit to the audience so they know who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. Again, I'm so excited to be here. This is so cool. My name is Kashif Shaikh. I am the co-founder and president of a nonprofit called the Pillars Fund. We're a Chicago-based organization that works all over the country in investing in American Muslim communities. So we're essentially a philanthropic organization that really tries to amplify and tell the stories of American Muslims, civic leaders, artists, etc. It's been a passion project and a baby of mine since we started it about 10 years ago. And it's been something that I've just been so honored and excited to be able to do. And, if you all want to learn more about the organization, go to pillarsfund.org. And, there's a lot of cool things that we've been doing lately, particularly a really great research project that we just launched that looked at Muslim representation in film and media. It's some really cool stuff happening. So thank you.
Amazing. Well, I have a friend from Missouri who is really super involved in Muslim amplification of Muslim voices in the United States, and like activism and awareness, and seeking to sort of like dismantle the stereotypes and the misconceptions around what Islam is in America and things like that. Have you ever heard of the Launch Good organization? Does that name ring a bell to you?
Yeah, of course. I know the founders of Launch Good really well. Yeah, they're amazing.
One of my
Shout out to
friends
Chris.
one of my friends works for Launch Good in New York City, and she's a really great friend of mine from back in Missouri. So hey, we have some worlds colliding here.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I love it.
Well, as you may know, I also host another podcast called Classical Ideas, where we talk about religion in the world and the influence of religion on how it impacts our society, whether a person cares about religion or not, how it's all around them on any given day. And so like it's so intertwined throughout our societies, and seeking to, have a deeper sense of religious literacy in the society with regards to bridge building is something that really matters to me. So I'm really excited to chat with you about the work that your organization is doing. And then we're going to tie that into the song that we're going to chat about here in a little while as well. But before we get into that, let's start off with something a little more simple. Like how you got into music and how you discovered Propaganda. Tell me all about this story of your origin with this particular band that we feature and talk about so much on this show.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this conversation, because part of what we're going to get into is how Propaganda actually, and I still refer to them as Propaganda because I've been calling them since I was that. I tried to do the Propaganda thing, and I was like, it just feels too weird.
Yeah.
And they were such a massive influence. So the way I got into them and the way I got into music is, so I'm 38 years old, and so I actually think I was like this kind of perfect generation, because Green Day broke out like when I was like 12 years old, and it changed my life. It completely changed my life. I was like a kid. I saw Basket Case on MTV. And the coolest thing about Green Day was that they were sort of taking out, if you go back and look, they were like taking like Pansy Division and the Queers with them on to selling out Madison Square Garden. And so I kind of got into the whole punk rock movement and the whole thing in the early 90s. And obviously, like as a kid, and I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. So that's what I think is really cool, is that I was like, there's a little kid in like Cincinnati, Ohio, being exposed to all of these like new bands, etc. And what was really cool was, as you've talked a lot about, is my friends and I got into the whole Epitaph, Fat Records. Like we kind of somehow found our way by having, back then it wasn't the internet. It was just kind of buying CDs and those samplers, the Fat Records, I can't remember the first one. The Survival of the Fattest was the one that really and that was the first time I'd actually heard Propaganda. Or I think it was that one of them had Nation States on there. And I just remember hearing that song and just thinking like, and I was starting to play guitar at the time. And I remember just being like, what the hell is he doing? Like, and it's funny now because their songs are so much more complex now. But even back then you were like, what the hell is this guitar part? But the way that I actually super got infatuated by Propaganda, which is a story I love to tell, is that so in the mid 90s, my friend Brendan, who was my next door neighbor, him and I were like, totally geeking out on all of this music. And if you remember, the internet was just starting to there was like AOL and stuff. And for some reason, I remember this so vividly that we used to be able to find these like WAV files. Brendan used to find these like WAV files, and we used to kind of like pass them along to one another. And I'll never forget. And I actually I think this was one of the craziest things, is that I'll never forget that he found this WAV file, and it was for the Propaganda song. It was off their first record, How to Clean Everything. It was the clip on Stick the Flag Up Your Ass, You Goddamn Son of a Bitch. It was just that one clip where it said, but wait a minute, Dad, like just that clip. And it was like, I don't know, 15, 20 seconds. And there was just that clip. And I remember listening to that clip being like, what the hell is this? It was like one of the coolest, as like a 13, 14-year-old, I just remember thinking it was like, I almost describe it to because I didn't know what it was. It was so in your face. It was about burning a flag. It was about all these different things. It was I don't like this. It just felt bad. I was like, I don't know what this is,
Yeah.
but this is super cool. And like, and then it was like, I remember like maybe a few months later, I was a kid, so who knows about the timeline and all of this, but like, I remember as a kid, I was with Brendan at our local record store. We used to walk down there all the time, and we found More Rock, Less Talk, like the album, like the CD. And by that point, I'd only heard clips, and I bought it, and I was just hooked. Like
Yeah.
that album just changed everything. I became obsessed with the liner notes. I was like reading, all the lyrics. It's because of that, like everything sort of opened up for me because of that record. And it was literally, what was it, like 25 years later, 26 years later, they're probably like, I'm still super into music. I still love the punk scene, but I don't love it the way obviously I did back when I was a kid.
Right.
But they're this one band that like to this day, I am absolutely obsessed with. Every new record and they're like, I love their new stuff so much more than I loved their old stuff, but I still love their old stuff.
Of course.
So it was just, and it changed everything for me. Like that record was the thing that introduced me to, idea. It just shattered every kind of, as a kid living in a mostly white suburb in Cincinnati, Ohio, it gave me sort of the blueprint for social activism. And I didn't know that's what, and then like, we can talk about this later, but like it influenced every part of my life. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today if it wasn't for that record.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So let's get into some of your work. I found your LinkedIn page, and we'll get connected on LinkedIn sometime too. But
yeah,
I kind of looked at your career trajectory, and you kind of came out of like an English literature background and then moved into like some like nonprofit and fundraising and grant sort of work. But I'm dying to know about your work with Pillars Fund and like how it like overlaps with all the mission stuff that you just mentioned about how propaganda sort of opened up your world to what is possible and doing good work in the world. So let's dive into your work. What is your sort of like overarching mission with what you're trying to accomplish with your organization, Pillars Fund?
Yeah. So, there's some context to be given here. My parents are immigrants from Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
And so I grew up like sort of first generation kid in Cincinnati, Ohio, brown kid in a mostly white suburb. All these different conflicting identities in the 90s, or I mean, still today, but like particularly in the 90s, it was heightened. And as I got into the punk scene, it was really kind of weird because I was like the only person of color in these rooms oftentimes. And so all of that was context. And then when I was 18 years old, 9/11 happened, which changed a lot of things for me and Muslims all around the country, because the discrimination and the sort of the attitudes towards Muslims that had been building for so long sort of just felt like it was okay. And, at Pillars, we've always said this one thing, which is that you don't wake up hating Muslims. Like this attitude towards Muslims has been created. It's biases that have been perpetuated and fostered and hardened by media narratives, by the way that, and 9/11 was certainly this sort of watershed moment where people started to really openly talk about how, Muslims weren't, shouldn't be in the US, and, all of these and then you had and then when you look at the sort of the war on terror, like it was such a weird time in America. And it was a weirder time for a college kid in Ohio trying to like navigate all of these different things. And I had already sort of pre 9/11, because of propaganda, I had read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. I'd started trying to get through Chomsky. I'd started, trying to get through all these different things because they were sort of talking about it. So these ideas around social justice had already been kind of put into my head in 16, 17, 18 years old. And so when 9/11 happened, it sort of felt like the first time that I had to do something. Like I felt like, well, like my community, the communities that I'm a part of are under attack. And so I kind of fell into the nonprofit world, partly because, I didn't know how to take this sort of like young activism, and I didn't know how to put it into action. And that's kind of how I fell into the nonprofit work post-college. And, for the Pillars Fund, which is what I started in 2010, really the idea was like super simple, which was I really wanted to build an organization or to support, the really amazing Muslims I knew in the U.S. Like there's such a diverse, complex community in the U.S. And I really wanted to have the world see all the cool things that I was seeing. And so we started this philanthropy with a few friends and started supporting fiscally these civic leaders, particularly in the early days. We were supporting a lot of legal organizations that were working, in everything from sort of defending the rights of Muslims, defending the rights for Muslims in the US and Guantanamo, like all these really cool kind of things. And the organization just sort of took off over the last 10 years. And it's been like what I've been spending all of my time on. And I really do. The reason I say that I couldn't have been doing this work today if it weren't for Propaganda is because they kind of introduced that blueprint of social activism. So when you look at the work we're doing at Pillars, it's really, really sort of, we're looking at the ways that Muslims are involved in all of these different issues, whether it be mass incarceration, whether it be like the war on drugs, whether it be immigration. Like Muslims have like this incredibly important history in the US. And we're really trying to support and find ways to amplify those narratives and kind of shift and change the ways that people see us, because it's not a religious organization. And I think that's one thing I want to be really clear to everyone listening, is that we're a social justice organization that's really trying to change the way and really kind of put out into the world really awesome things that Muslims are doing. And and there's just so many connections to Propaganda, and I'm so grateful to them. Truthfully, I'm just incredibly grateful to them, because I wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for them.
Yeah. And, the post 9/11 world, the pre and post 9/11 world is a shift that I vividly remember as well. I think you and I graduated from high school in the same year, 2002.
2001 for me. Yeah.
Okay,
roughly.
cool. So we were both in like that senior year thing where like 9/11 happens. And like for me, I was such an idiot growing up in the suburbs of St. Louis. Like I knew that Islam was like a religion, but then 9/11 happens and all I see on television for weeks and weeks and months is these depictions of Islam around the world in a totally negative light. And if I didn't have like a competing message of like from bands like Propaganda who are like saying like, no, we really like, this is like, it's not okay to jump to conclusions about different, like about religions and like about people around the world. That, without those things, it's entirely possible that I would have just gone into the total right-wing narrative and just fit right in with what all the messages that were surrounding me. So it's like a super important thing that I had these voices in my music that were challenging me to look beyond the simplistic and reductive narratives that I was being fed on the mass media and by like my family and like by my friends' families and things like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's very real. It's like what I said earlier, is that this idea that you don't just wake up hating Muslims, it's really reinforced.
Yeah.
Like we just released this study with the actor Riz Ahmed, and just it came out like 2 weeks ago.
Oh, he's great.
Yeah, he's amazing, and we're doing this really awesome project with him. And we did this research study with the University of Southern California, and it looked at all of the sort of hard data in terms of what Muslim characters, how they show up in popular television and film, and it's crazy. It's absolutely insane. Like the representation of Muslims is essentially zero, or when they do exist, their relationship to terror or violence, it's almost always the case. There's no very little Black Muslim representation, very little representation of women, of Muslim women, and all of these really reinforce this idea and of that Muslims are this sort of like ancient people that are violent and all of these different things, when the reality is that we're like a young, vibrant, we at Pillars, we always sort of say this thing where, we are not here to sort of, we're not trying to do the what we're really trying to do is kind of like highlight and showcase the abundance and the joy of Muslim communities in the US, because I think that's how you really start to create change.
Yeah, well, and I'm thinking about some of my own turning points as well, like so obviously teaching a religious studies class in a high school is huge for my own personal growth. And I'm really grateful that I've had the opportunities to kind of shepherd teenagers through learning about Islam, through like firsthand conversations with like guest speakers in my classroom and things like that. And like having my other podcasts where I can like put those messages out into the world about bridge building as opposed to wall building. And then I'm also thinking about discovering the novels of Mohsin Hamid from Lahore, Pakistan, who wrote The Reluctant Fundamentalist and Exit West and all of his other fantastic novels. And then I'm also thinking about the Hulu TV series that's out right now about Rami Youssef, the comedian.
Shout out to Rami, he's great.
There's so much stuff that's happening that people can find about reshaping and reframing the negative perceptions and stereotypes that we've been sort of constructed in our brains for the last like 2 decades. I mean, it's really powerful, the amount of things out there that are happening that are good, as opposed to just constantly buying into the narrative of somebody is our enemy. You know what I mean? And living in fear frequently. So I love what you're doing. It's so cool. Do you have any like major successes that you'd like to highlight? Like some things that you're personally like, I can't believe this happened. This is so amazing.
Well, I think probably the thing, you're catching me at the right time, probably this project that we're doing with Riz Ahmed, who like we've all been a fan of, who's so incredible.
He's in that new movie about the drummer, right?
Yeah, Sound of Metal, which
amazing movie.
It's incredible, and we, for those of you who are interested, we just launched this really cool project about 2 weeks ago. There's a big write-up on it in Variety. We're launching this project. We worked with the University of Southern California and Riz Ahmed about this big, as I mentioned earlier, this big research study. But outside of that, we're launching this thing called the Pillars Artist Fellowship, which we're really stoked about. It's going to be a program that selects Muslim artists and gives them $25,000 in unrestricted grants to be able to do basically whatever they want to do. And we're going to be working with this incredible, like Riz likes to call it, like the Muslim Avengers. We're working with some like the most amazing people: Mahershala Ali, Hassan Minaj, Sana Amanat from Miss Marvel, obviously Riz, just so many incredible people. And we're super stoked about it. It's a project. Learn more about it on our website, pillarsfund.org. Follow us on social. I think you'll dig what we're doing. We're really, really excited about this project in particular. And, we're really trying to empower this next generation of Muslim artists and civic leaders because they're doing awesome stuff. Like Rami's a perfect example of like people who are just doing such cool stuff and having a bigger and bigger platform. So we're just, we're excited about the future, and I'm incredibly grateful that I get to do this. And this conversation is super cool because it's such an intersection of all of those identities, including my music identity, which is just as important to me.
Nice. Well, I'm curious about your leadership of the organization and any challenge that you may face. So you are Muslim, running an organization that invests in and supports the talents of American Muslims, and you are in the context of a world that is post 9/11 and for many years was very war on terror centric, with all the narratives that come with that and the decades and decades of endless wars that we've been involved in now. And I'm wondering about the challenges and scrutiny that an organization like yours faces, because I would imagine that you have to be so perfect and pristine, and I'd imagine that there's a lot of challenges that come with that as well, because I'd imagine there's people who watch your organization closely.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because Hassan Minaj talks about this. He did this interview, I think it was like Vanity Fair or something like this, about the idea that like people of color often have to like show up like in their most perfect form. Whereas like, white people can really kind of, there's just so much that can sort of show up in all these different ways.
Yep.
And so you're totally right. I mean, I think that, we've been really fortunate that, we've taken the leadership and sort of the running of the organization very, very seriously. And we're incredibly proud of all of the things that we've done, including, the leadership team I have in place, et cetera. It's been really fun, but you're 100% right. I mean, I think that there's, this idea that, people don't want to see there's an entire contingency. You see this with like Ilhan Omar, like, she just like opens her mouth and like people are just like, they don't want to see her. They don't want to see a Black refugee hijabi woman in that position.
Mm-hmm.
And so absolutely there comes scrutiny, but I will say, like, I tend not to focus on that because I'm so overjoyed by the Muslim communities in the US and all the cool shit we're doing. And basically I look at my job as being able to like amplify and support that cool stuff. And so there's this thing where in my head where I'm like, yes, there's scrutiny and yes, there's all this stuff, but I'm just so full of joy to be able to like support these amazing people and like have the world see all that they're doing, that's kind of what keeps me sustained and excited about all the work.
Amazing. Okay. So how does like propaganda sort of inform your day-to-day life and how like you run this organization? Like, is there any like philosophical overlap between this band and this music and this organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like, it's like sort of what I was saying earlier is that, propaganda really introduced me to a world that I didn't know existed. And so, like, it's funny, I've seen them in concert so many times and I've gotten a chance to like talk to them a few times after the show. And I just love that, like, when you're a kid, you think of these, like, you're like, who are these people from like Winnipeg, like talking about all these things, and you meet them and they're just like three kind of nerds from Winnipeg who just like really like don't even, I think, understand the influence that they've had, and they're almost like weirded out by it, like, like I remember I think it was Chris I was talking to, and I was telling him, I was like, hey, like, and he got a little awkward because I don't think he knew what to say or do, because I think for him, they were just putting out music and talking about ideas that were important to them. And, it had this mass reach. And I think, at least in my case, it really informed, the framework, the world that I could envision because of something they put out was what I've been striving for to this day. I grew up in a very anti-gay community in Cincinnati. I grew up in a very conservative community that, like, when my good friend came out to me when I was like 15 years old, it was crazy because I also had like the understanding of the struggle of queer people. I had like all these like intersectional ideas, and I didn't know it. I didn't have the language at the time to really understand what was happening. And I think for me, when I think about their influence, I think about, not only do they sort of shred these ideas that they sort of put into my head at a young age are still incredibly relevant today. So they're a band I think about, often because of that.
Something I'm really curious about is like, I can't pretend to know or understand like your own personal like religious convictions about the world, but like you are associated with a particular religion as far as like the professional work that you do. So propaganda in the past has, expressed some, very critical views of religion.
Yeah.
And you were probably exposed to those views very, very poignantly while you were, a young person. Tell me a little bit about how you process and reconcile propaganda's religious critique with your own life as like a fan of this band. Does that make sense?
I'm so excited that you asked me that question because it's something that I really, really wanted to talk about. So on that first record, How to Clean Everything, there's that song. I always don't know how to pronounce his name.
Haile Selassie.
Haile Selassie, Up Your Ass. So that song, which to this day is still like musically one of my absolute favorite songs. It was also the song that kind of introduced me to the struggle in Israel and Palestine. So like, it has a special place in my heart. So at the end of it, that whole fuck religion thing he has. And so I have a lot of thoughts on that. So the first was, as a kid that grew up, in a somewhat religious home, with a mom that was very religious, sort of hearing the idea, and for her, I think for me, like hearing the idea that there was people that believe different things, the idea that like some people didn't subscribe to a religion was actually kind of revolutionary to me at a young age, because I just was like a Muslim kid who thought everyone sort of, you were Muslim or Christian or Jewish. Like that's like what I thought of the world as a young kid. And then so it was like, on so one hand, I was like, oh, wow, like there's this whole like idea, it was kind of like the first time I'd heard about atheism. I didn't actually I couldn't fathom a world in which people didn't believe in a God, because I was like, I just thought that like you believed in different like shades of that God, but I didn't know you just couldn't, there was people who just didn't believe in a God. So in some ways it was kind of really powerful to me to hear sort of this critique of religion. On the other hand, as I get older, I just don't agree with it. And I think that's partly where I love this band, is that I don't agree politically. I agree with everything they've said, but there's definitely things, this idea of sort of that religion is this evil thing, etc., which I just don't agree with that. I think religion is an incredibly powerful force. I think religion, like any type of ideology, whether it be nationalism, whether it be whatever, can be used to sort of further, evil intentions. But I think that spirituality and religion can actually be a really beautiful thing. I saw this with my mom. My mom died about 7 years ago, and she was a deeply religious woman, and it was her faith that was giving her comfort towards the end of her life. And so when I hear things like that, like, I get really angry, because I'm like, essentially when you're like, fuck religion, but what you're saying is, you're trying to like sort of take away some of that comfort that I saw that my mom had. That being said, and I know that, even their views on these things have evolved a lot. And
definitely,
and you definitely don't want to hold people accountable to things they wrote when they were like 23, 24 years old. That's a weird thing about being like a musician, is that like, I think someone described it like, imagine like your teenage diaries, like just being out into the world for like the rest of the world. So I certainly, like, while I disagreed with that, I think that, and I actually think even for them, and I haven't had this conversation with them, my guess is that particularly in a post 9/11 world, they probably saw like, oh, there's definitely ways we could have said things differently, or maybe that's not exactly what we meant. And because I'm all about being critical of religion. If that's what you want to do, I have no problem with it. There's no value for it, etc. Like, I think that's when you get into like really, really problematic territory. But certainly don't have to subscribe to it. So yeah, it's definitely been this like kind of like really, it was weird as a kid, like, and listening to it. In some ways, I'm just really happy that I got exposed to it, because even now when I'm like older and being able to parse through some of these words, but they did expose me to ideas and a worldview that I just wasn't exposed to when I was a kid. And so, yeah, it's been that like kind of a funny little relationship when it comes to that, but it hasn't influenced it. Frankly.
Absolutely. And, I think that like Chris's own personal reflections on, he does his own podcast, and he talked a lot about that song. And I love the idea of his reflections, looking back on that over the years and being like, oh, that just doesn't go down well. And one of the main reasons that I have avoided doing that Haile Selassie episode so far on this show is because I completely disagree with the closing lyrics of that song. I find religion to be an interesting human cultural thing that exists across time and space and unites like our species of humanity across all of human history. Like, you take modern societies like here and now, and you look at societies from centuries and millennia ago, and what is a thread that runs all the way through that? It's a spiritual approach to life. And so I think about it as one of our most deeply ingrained and most human characteristics, as opposed to something to just like cast off and be like, well, religion poisons everything, as Christopher Hitchens once said. And I just find that to be kind of boring and kind of dull to just, just toss it and cast it aside. So I'm with you. And I'm glad that I asked that question, because I have a very similar sentiment to it.
Yeah, I'm so glad that it's been something that I always think about, and I've always given them the benefit of the doubt, because, I think that they've always put out these like really incredible progressive ideas. And sometimes, yeah, as a kid reading that, I'll tell you, man, as a kid, it's like, it shook me, because I was like, oh, I don't think I'm allowed to say this or listen to this. And so that's why it was like kind of interesting to hear it, but also like I can look back at it and be like, yeah, I definitely don't agree with that at all.
Did you have to hide your propaganda CDs when you were a kid?
You know, I didn't, only because it was so like, you know, my parents were like these wonderfully sweet immigrants who, like, you know, my dad was just stoked. My dad's like a music fan, so he's really excited that I was like listening to music.
Nice.
My mom was super cool about all my CDs. I think, you know, she was just like, make sure you read the Quran, make sure you read, you know, like she was just like trying to make sure
The
that I was still
balance.
like a good Muslim, like the balance to it. But they had no idea that what they were saying. I'm sure if my mom had heard that song, she would have like burned that album. Like she would have been like, no, like you cannot listen to this. And so I was able to just like listen to it on my Discman as a kid. And yeah, it was the same thing with comedy. I'm a huge comedy fan, and like I got introduced to George Carlin when I was a young kid, and it's like sort of changed everything for me. And so, you know, I just think they didn't know what they were actually saying.
I love it. Well, it's that scream too, like in the lyrics, like them thinking about, you know, fuck the troops to hell. And I'm like, holy smokes, if my parents had like understood what he was screaming, that CD would have been like thrown in the fireplace, and they would have been just melted plastic going up through the chimney flue.
Totally.
So, Kashif, when we got in touch ages ago, you mentioned to me that you wanted to be on the show and be on the Note to Self episode. And so before we touch on that, we haven't talked about failed states at all. Tell me what you think about failed states, like as a whole product.
Yeah, I love it. So, you know, I love the evolution of this band. I think I know that where I'm in good company when I say Supporting Cast is the best album they ever put out, like beginning to end. That I you know, it's so hard to compete with that album. That was the one that I just think like just pure perfection. Love it. I love Failed States. I thought Failed States was such an incredible record. I have, you know, like the cool thing about Propagandi's catalog is that the way that it's such a natural growth. They've demonstrated this, like, really, obviously it's like so different from like their early stuff, but it really feels like people who are trying to push themselves musically, lyrically. And so I thought Failed States it was such a banger. Like you know, it was a heavy record. And that's why I loved Note to Self. I have so many thoughts on Note to Self. And I picked it for like a very, very specific reason. Which I'll go ahead and tell you why I picked it, because I think so no one in my life likes Propagandhi. No one. Like, not okay. I'll go even one step further. They hate Propagandhi. Like they're just like and I don't get mad about it, because listen, if you're not into punk, metal, thrash, like this isn't going to be your speed. I get it. Like no shade. Like you know, and so like I picked this song because for two reasons. One, I thought it was like one of their most like accessible songs. Like I thought that like you know, and I did this like little experiment, like you know, I knew I was coming onto the show in my life who hate Propagandhi. So I was like, let me just play Note to Self, because I feel like it's still heavy, but it's got that like incredible, beautiful, like atmospheric, like, you know, like that whole like 1.5 minute sort of intro. And so I played it for a few people to be like, yeah, it's great, right? Like, this is really good. And you know, it's funny because I don't think my hypothesis really like bared out, because they were like, yeah, the first like 1.5 minutes is awesome, and then when he starts screaming, like, no, I'm not into it. So it kind of like so I picked it because I loved it, and I really do think that it's like it was just like a really accessible song that, you know, if you're not even a fan of the band, that you could potentially listen to and be like, okay, cool. The other reason I picked it is, you know, lyrically, one thing that I've really, really appreciated about Propagandhi is like the self-awareness, the idea that they're not just putting out ideas into the world and being like, do this, do this, do this, but also like always like reflecting inwardly and being like, man, like, what the fuck are we doing? Like, what are we doing in this world? Like, how are we making it a better place? And so I think that like the combination of those two reasons made this song. And I also, like, you know, I have this like very distinct memory. I think Failed States was the first record they put out on Epitaph, right? Was it the first record?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So I remember like when the news came out that they're putting out Epitaph, I was just confused. I was like, whoa, that's kind of random, because Epitaph is still like really these days. But like I was like, cool, I'm down for this. I mean, they put out Converge. I'm into it.
Yeah.
And then when they put out the teaser video for the new record, it was like the intro for Note to Self, and I just remember being like, is that a Propagandhi song? It's so so beautiful and so good. And so it has this like this just distinct memory and also like childlike excitement for a new Propagandhi record. Like, so there's all these kind of things that got the song, why I thought the song was going to be really fun to talk about.
This is a really interesting record too, because this song alludes to Islam if you read the lyrics in that way in the very beginning of the song in the lyrics. But there's also the reference to, the Muslim punk rock crackdown in Aceh, in Indonesia, in Rattan Kane. Like, tell me about your realization of like, holy smokes, they're talking about Islam on this record on a couple of points. Like, did you make that connection between this little thread?
I only made that connection for the Indonesian when they were talking about the Rattan Kane. Like I made that observation. So and I think it was really interesting because for me, I sit with the Propagandhi record like pretty intensely and like first just get through it musically and just kind of like really listen to it and get into it, and then and really kind of like sort of parse through the themes. And I think it's kind of what you said. One of the things that I've really liked about it is there isn't like evolution. And I mean, I think Victory is that where it's, with a Hitchens song, I love the sort of like how they're willing to almost like call themselves out too. Like, I think their growth is so evident on a record like that. And so, yeah, I definitely caught parts of it, but I have to admit, like listening to your guys' podcast, like I feel like a terrible fan compared to you all because you really sort of delve into like everything, and I just try to like take it in, and I learn from you guys. Like when I listen to the podcast, I'm like, oh shit, I didn't even know that was a thing that they were referencing, and so it's really cool.
Well, okay, so in your life, I'm curious about your reaction to the opening lyric. No fly list, no drive list, no walk list, no talk list. Tell me your reaction to that first line.
Well, I mean, I think as a Muslim, the words like no fly list, like they're like so synonymous. Like, like I think for me, I like my immediate reaction to that is just this idea that unfortunately sort of the history of Muslims, particularly since 9/11, around sort of the ways that we've been treated on flying on airplanes and the suspicion and all of those sort of things. So my immediate reaction is like when I hear no fly list, like that, there's such a like a specific kind of connotation growing up the way that I did around it.
Nice. Well, I'm curious about what you think about the performance. Like, this is like a 6-minute plotting tune, which is like a serious outlier as far as Propagandhi goes, but also a serious outlier as far as like their opening tracks on the record go. Does this really, do you have any particular thoughts on the musical performance of the band on this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, it's partly why I picked it is because it's a really different song. Like it's a really different song than they've put out. And so for me, I love, they said this in this interview that before the Beeve joined the band, like one of the things we them with the second guitar player was sort of like the atmospheric, kind of the moody sort of guitar parts. And like when I was like listening to the song, I was just like, it's so like, it just captures you so quickly because it goes on for so long. And so I love that it was an opening track I think it's like one of the most perfect opening tracks because just the juxtaposition between that sort of atmospheric sort of intro to then like the heavier part, that ends the song. I love like I said, I love to see these guys because they've really pushed themselves musically. They really, really pushed themselves. And it was so different. I love to see things they do that are just different. And I loved this opening track. I loved that sort of intro. It's so and we can talk about this too. It's like how they play it perfectly live too, which is like, I don't understand these guys at all, how they're like real people, because I've seen that performance on YouTube as well and live, and I think they played it when I saw them. It sounds exactly the same. I don't understand, like they just capture it so well.
So I asked you about the opening line. Do you have any thoughts on the rest of the lyrics at all that really jump out at you that you wanted to comment on before just before we end our conversation today?
Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts on the rest of the lyrics, because
lay it on me.
So for me, so the song is really interesting for a couple of different reasons. So, the way that I sort of really interpret the song is this idea that, what are we doing? Like, how are we complicit in the sort of upholding these structures of oppression? And I really sort of appreciate the idea of sort of looking inwardly. And like, I think, even just like that lyric, like, how does it make you feel to know that you just stood by and watched it? I think that to me is like, it really hits you hard, because, and I think for me, it's like when you get older and you start to and I think, I'm in my late 30s, and you start to be reflective about your life, you sort of get to this moment. My guess is like Chris is definitely at this moment too, like be reflective on, what have I done in my life? Like, what have I done? Like, and I've heard him in interviews sort of, again, I think he sort of really underplays the influence that he's had on so many people. But I know that sometimes, like, I've heard him just be very dismissive of himself and being like, I was just like a dumb kid playing music. Like, like, what have I really done? And obviously I would disagree with that. But so for me, part of what really, like, it's like that self-awareness, it's that, like, when the cops and the courts refuse to confess the sins of the few, what is there left to do? Like, I mean, come on. Like, I think they've had this incredible way to be able to really use these songs. Like, I think what's always made them different from other bands, like, and I'm not hating on bands like Anti-Flag and others, like, I think they're great, but there's always been like a personal connection. Like, their lyrics have always felt more like them grappling with these like really intense ideas and trying to make sense of them all, and almost as being like, like, this is what I think, this is what we need to do, but what the fuck do I know? And I've always appreciated that about Propaganda. And I think with Note to Self, for me, that's what really jumps out at me about this song, is this ability to be reflective. I will also say that, like, one thing that the only part of the song that I maybe like don't love or maybe disagree with is that I'm a big believer in joy too. Like, I'm a big believer in sort of like, like, I think that, like, we should, the world is falling apart and we need to be doing our part to really fighting against it. But I also do believe in this moment of like celebrating and being joyful and recognizing that, like, we as a people have a lot to do. And so sometimes I feel like they can be a little depressing, and I like sometimes, like, you can be like, I looked at the song and I was like, I love it, I love what you're saying, but also, like, I think it's okay to look back and being like, I am doing something. It doesn't mean you're doing everything. It doesn't mean that, like, you can always be doing more. But I do think that sort of holding yourself to this impossible standard, I think, can feel kind of exhausting. And so, that's the only part of it that I really kind of felt a little like, but I get it. Like, I understand where they're coming from, and I loved what he was really trying to do with the song.
I do too. And, I think about how many people out there want to do more, but how we live in this society where, like, right now we're experiencing this insane trend where housing is like skyrocketing in prices. Goods for things like home repairs are skyrocketing in prices. Salaries are completely stagnant. And we're in this thing where people are earning like early 1990s salaries in a 2021 world. And like, we're barely getting by. So like, I think about all the people who desperately want to do more to make this world a better place, but like how we're all just like confined to this paycheck to paycheck, barely scraping by existence. So even though we want to do more, we're just like hustling just to barely get by. And it's such a disappointing and disillusioning trend of being like, wow, I have all these things I would love to do to contribute to a better world, but I'm just like stuck in this trend where I can't get out, and I can't do more because I'm barely making it myself. You know what I mean?
Well, and I think to me, there was this other thing that I was trying to say around that, is like the contradiction of Propaganda sometimes is something I really love as well. Is like, so the lyric, like, the band, the sports, the booze, it's all that's left of you. Yeah. It's really funny because, like, I actually thought that was such an interesting line because, Chris obviously is no secret about like his obsession with hockey and sort of like how much he loves it. And it almost feels like this like self-critical thing. But I think, to your point, sometimes when you're living this life that's like, so it's so challenging, like there are these small things, like hockey brings him joy. And I almost feel guilty about that. And I think that's like where, for me, it's like trying to celebrate the joy and trying to be like in these moments of, like you said, there is, you know, like life is really difficult. Life feels, you know, particularly this past year, it's been so incredibly difficult for so many people. And sometimes it's these small things that bring them happiness. And it's hard. I think for me, what's really hard is it's like, how do you find the balance between more, but also trying to like be present in your own life and try to not be so hard on yourself. It's just something I've thought about as I've gotten older. And again, it's another reason I love the band so much, is because they challenge me in ways like this. And I love sort of interacting with their lyrics in a way that, like, because, you know, like what's cool about it is if you talk to me like in 3 weeks, you know, 3 weeks from now, or 3 weeks from, you know, or 3 weeks ago, maybe I'd have a slightly different take on it, because it's like, I really like to engage and try to understand, like, not only what they're trying to say, but how it applies to my own life. And I've always just found that to be like super interesting. I'm so grateful to you both. Like, I love this podcast. It's so cool for me to be on here. Thank you so much for having any interest in having me.
Of course.
I've just completely loved this conversation. It's always fun to geek out about Propagandhi. And I think for me, I've really wanted to share how that band influenced what I'm doing, because, you know, that's why Note to Self to me was really important, was because I have always tried to do something. Like, you know, they put these ideas into my head when I was 15, 16, 17 years old. And I'm still trying. I'm not perfect, and there's a lot more to do, but I wouldn't be in this field of activism and philanthropy and all these things if it weren't for this band. So I'm just so grateful to them.
Awesome. Well, Kashif, this has been just such a fantastic conversation, and here's to more. You know what I mean? We'll keep in touch down the line, and we'll chat more. And I get over to Chicago, so we'll go see a show. Okay.
Let's do it.
All right, Kashif, thank you so much for coming on Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda. It means the world to me.
Thank you.
Left to take stock of the wholesale omission of outside perspectives. How does it make you feel to know that you voted for this?
You know, Keith, I want to go over some of these musical notes that I've got with you. And, you know, there's some things about the song that are very unique and fascinating. And the main thing that immediately jumps out is the 1 and 47-second long introduction, which is when the vocals come in. And funnily, I can't ever forget that my favorite Propagandhi moment ever is the yes in supporting cast, which also hits at 147. So apparently 1 minute and 47 seconds is becoming my auspicious Propagandhi number. So this has got this 1 and 47-second long introduction. And I'm wondering, you know, any thoughts that you have about this leading segment going into this song?
I guess I have some things to share that we'll get into when we get into the guitars and the bass and such.
Well, let's dive into that. So, you know, I looked in the book, the book from Sheet Happens, standard tune, guitars and bass. This song on guitar is like a journey. I picked up my guitar and I was trying to do some of it, and I figured out the da na 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 na. I figured that part out on guitar because it's really not that hard. But you have this beautiful spacey intro lick, and then you have like the rock licks that sounds like it would fit on an AC/DC record. Which is really cool, because I heard an interview with Jordan recently where he said that one of his Desert Island records is AC/DC. So, you know, and then it's got that freak out at about 3 minutes, and then that big, like, metal, riffy, shreddy outro. So something about this intro that really jumps out to me is the lead in with the ebow. And then it goes through these 4 little passes, intro lick sections with like this nice little tremolo bend on the 4th pass. And it's wild that this little section is like 40 seconds long to me, but It's 17 bars in the sheet music before the drums kick in. So we've got
Wow.
this
Yeah.
this really long section before drums come in at all, you know?
I'm also surprised. Again, I know nothing about music, but that it is in standard just because it feels heavy, right? It feels
Mhm.
like a heavy song. And one of the most memorable parts for me in the composition, especially in the intro, is like that call and response use of the guitars at the very beginning. There's the baying feedback, almost like a siren in the background. And the Beav and Chris just going back and forth with that spacey picked out riff before the big power chords come in that eventually like carry over that call and response section. So that's really what I think of when I think of the intro is
Yeah.
the feedback and then the back and forth between the Beav and Chris.
Yeah, you know, and I was thinking, I was like looking at all the timings as the song was going through, because I was like looking for these like specific moments where something really important to me happens. And at 1:33, when that riff kicks in until the vocals come in, that like howl on under the guitar riff is just unbeatable, where it's got that like woo, that loud hum. Like they don't seem to do as much of that EBO howl live based on some of the videos I'm able to find, but sometimes they have that howl live and sometimes they don't, and which you don't really notice much when it's missing live. But the differences between that loud howl from 1:33 to 1:47 is really noticeable in the studio versus live versions. Like a live performance at the festival called Gas Dies Calling in 2018 with Sue Lin on guitar has the very noticeable howl live. But like I can't really see how it's happening. So I'm not really sure when they include it live, like who's doing that or what. But you know, I was thinking about that howl and how essential and important that is, like right before the vocals come in.
And there's an interesting use of, you know, sounds in ways that just create so much personality and landscape with it within this track. Like also the plucking of the strings, according to the Sheet Happens book, it's behind the bridge. So for a long time, like I thought it was a piano, you know, where there's like that really high, almost wound too tight plucking sound you see bands sometimes doing on the headstock as well.
Yeah.
But I always thought it was like, you know, really high keys on a piano that it adds like this eerie feel to it, but it totally fits in with the themes and the sonic concepts that are found all throughout the track.
You know, and just before we move on from this intro, I got to hand it to him on this song and on Last Will and Testament, stuff like that. Like, I don't know. I don't think this exists anywhere else in Propagandy's catalog. And to be honest with you, I don't know if it ever will again. Right. Like it feel like there's not a long intro song like this on Victory Lap. And I'm wondering if like Last Will and Note to Self might be some of the only times that we hear that from this band on record. Like you never know, obviously it could happen, but those are two pretty special songs in that regard when you get down to analyzing those long intros, you know?
Yeah. Imagine like traveling back to the 90s and giving some skater punk with a Toy Machine hoodie and pipe jeans a copy of this record and saying that it's Propagandy. You know, what they would think. Only hearing maybe How to Clean Everything. But, you know, once the vocals kick in, there's still that call and response in place, but it switched from that spacey, quiet melody made eerie and unsettling by the feedback to those just super thick, chunky power chords, again, that sound heavier than they are. And that there's a ton of bends or whammy or whatever right at you voted for this, like that part that adds like way more texture and a way like I think uncertainty and uneasiness right before the switch with what a grunt, and then followed right up with the fuck this, like both of those interjections I think being right up there with the supporting cast. Yes.
Yeah, you know, and like that wah section that kicks in at about 3 minutes after the stood by and watched it line is so freaking cool. And then it goes in like three-fourths time until going into like the 5/4 beat at Dazed Numb. So like there's a little bit of like, you know, playing a little bit with the time signature as well. And it's just so cool. There's like a little bit of playing around with that stuff.
Yeah, I love this section. Really sick guitar tones. The riffs are new. It's kind of proggy, and that lead riff under Dazed Numb, like that part with like the higher lead. Oh, that's so good.
Yeah. Like I love the while we frantically click our heels already part, because it pretty much hits like a new chord on the guitar every single time a syllable gets sung vocally. If you go and you listen to that part, while we frantically click our heels already home, like he's hitting there's a new chord hit on like every single syllable of those words. And it's just really awesome. And, you know, I don't know if you got into any of the guitars, like playing around with it at all.
I did not.
Okay, so I did. And this was wild because I am horrible at guitar, but we get to that section at 3:35 where Chris is going fast and quiet on the A string, going like 0-3-7-3-0-3-8-3 in that little run that leading up to and through the bands, the sports, the booze, while Beeve just does wacky stuff on the whammy with some delays, while Todd has those big chunky low notes before going into that very pretty high run underneath When the Cops. Before that super fast picked run after Refuse, while Beeve does that string rake behind the bridge that you were talking about, and then into the fuzz pedal after What Is There Left to Do. I'm like, wow, this might be one of the most atmospheric propaganda songs imaginable. This song has everything going for it guitar wise. It is a journey. It's got it all.
Yeah, I remember getting to this part the first time I heard it and thinking, who is this and what is happening? You know, that riff is like that first riff that I'm not going to sing it. You are the riff singer. Yeah, right. That is dark and layered. It adds to like the crescendo effect that the entire song embodies. And that whole section there is, I honestly think, one of the most unique musical creations the band has done in their entire career. It stands out. It is memorable. It's incredibly well written and performed, and I don't know, there's just not much else like it.
I know. And then so I got out my guitar and I was hitting that, and that section goes from 3:35 to 5:25. So we're talking about almost 2 straight minutes of Chris just doing that little guitar march. And it's so long and it's so disciplined. It's like, it's just got that. It's just so regimented the way that he does it. And I was like watching him do it live at these recent shows, and it's just effortless watching him do it. But like whenever I try to do it, I can make it a couple of times, but like I got that weak pinky action going on in my left hand here. So like I just can't even do it. But it's so long and so disciplined, and he just stays on it the whole time. And then you get that stuff that Beeve did over the top of it. And it's just wild, but Chris is just back there holding that down the whole time for 2 straight minutes. I love it. And then that wah pedal kicks in at 5:45 to take us all the way to the end. And I'm like, woo! And at the live shows, I posted a video of the outro of this song, and you got Robin, the metal sweeper, with his 6 foot long dreadlocks, you know, headbanging like between the stage and the barricade, and it on that outro part with those wah pedals. And it's just wild, man. It's just so crazy.
Yeah, everything after Rise is just straight up goosebump inducing. I tried my best to follow along with the tab book, but I could not keep up. So like always, I just ended up rewatching Clem Last Note's cover, which helped me at least visualize some of my favorite riffs. So if you are like me and you're not musically inclined, of course, I recommend all of his Propaganda covers, but this one especially.
Yeah, well, and it's awesome we had Steven come in to chat about the song as well, to kind of walk us through our stumbling over chatting about this song. You and I, like, we're kind of like these like ideas guys, where we like get so far out into like the weeds of how the songs thematically connect to like events in the world, and then when we hit the music, we're both just like,
this riff rules.
This riff kicks butt, man. But on the bass, if you read the tablature booklets, you can find some notes in there in that Sheet Happens book. And, Todd points out in the Sheet Happens book, like parts of the bass, which are played without a pick. So, there's just some good notes in there that the band put in to help you understand it if you're trying to go through it. So if you've never looked at those books, definitely consider doing it, because they're super worthwhile.
Yeah. And if I don't know much about guitar, I know even less about bass playing or composition. But to me, I think this song is a really great example of bass both supporting and augmenting the guitars and drums by, one, echoing what they're doing, while other times changing what is happening with unexpected notes or melodies that add just like a ton of character and texture to the song. And the remastered version really allows you to hear Todd, standing out and upholding and adding to this already super unique track.
Yeah, and if you listen like real closely to that remastered version at high volume, there's about 1.5 seconds at the very end of the song before Failed States kicks in, where you can hear the room ringing after the drum tracking. And it's like the loudest silence. Like, if you've never listened to Note to Self really loud in the remastered version, you can hear that room ringing in the studio, like hearing Jord's cymbals kind of like fade out. And I just imagine Jord like sitting motionless at his drum set, being like, "Was that the take?" That's awesome. in this room where the cymbal like bleed is kind of fading in the monitors and everything. I'm just like, oh, that's such a cool moment where you're like, I think that was the take. I love that feeling, This is a long song, as we've already mentioned, very long. And like I just said, I went and they're still playing this song live a lot. And I was thinking about the scope of like a 60 to 70 minute set in a live show, and how this song at 6 minutes, what a time investment this song is. When you've got 60 or 70 minutes, you're talking about 10% of a set. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Is just this one song. And I was like, I wonder what else they could fill that time with in order to really pack the set list full. And I found out that if you take out Note to Self from the live set, you can play Ego Sum Papa, Status Update, Fucking Rich, Fuck the Poor, This Is Your Life, Nailing Descartes to the Wall, and Rio de San Atlanta, Manitoba in less time than it would take to play Note to Self. If you just play them back to back all the way through, you could play 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 songs that like, and really just pack the set list full in the amount of time it takes just to do this one song, which is pretty crazy to me,
It's like when I walk to work and I think, do I want to listen to one Opeth song or 10 Nasm songs?
Yeah. So, you got to really respect the fact that the band believes in this song so much that they could play up to 6 other songs in the amount of time it takes them to play just this one, but they choose to do this one. So like, to me, that shows like the place that the band has for this song, like in their like rankings of their own material, that they make the investment to, spend up to 10% of their set just on this one tune. So that's pretty wild,
Yeah, I saw it in 2014, and I'm pretty sure they played it again in Chicago in 2018. So yeah, I'm thankful that this is one that has remained in their set lists.
Well, Keith, it's been a couple of months since I've chatted with you, and I am dying to get into these lyrics with you. So, there is a blurb from Todd on the website talking about what this song means. And I think that would be useful to start off by reading Todd's own words before we get into our analysis. So Todd says, this song is written by Chris and is about your own laziness and personal conformity and a yearning to rise out of a preoccupation with yourself. You are watching TV or sports, or in my case, it'd be excessive time spent listening to Razor, which Razor's from Guelph, Ontario, and members of Razor were at the Guelph show, which was pretty sweet. So Todd goes on. It's about trying to get out and do something to make the world better rather than marinating in your juices at home. So many people spend too much time getting wasted and doing things that aren't really helping anybody. They're not creative. They're not doing anything for themselves or anybody else. It's just a note to self to go and do something. So I thought that summary was so well said and concise that I felt it was useful to include right here before we get into the lyrics.
Yeah, good place to start.
Yeah, so we got this opening line. No fly list, no drive list, no walk list, no talk list. And so obviously the first thing I'm doing whenever I prep for this episode is I'm going to Google no fly list, which I found is extraordinarily not fun to Google. Just typing that into my search engine was extremely paranoia inducing. Nobody wants to do an internet search for that term because all of our internet activity is tracked. And so I did not like doing internet search for that term, but here's what I found. The no-fly list is maintained by the United States federal government's Terrorist Screening Center. It is one of several lists used by government agencies and airlines to decide who to allow to board airline flights. The TSC's no-fly list is a list of people who are prohibited from boarding commercial aircraft for travel within, into, or out of the United States. This list also has been used to divert aircraft away from U.S. airspace that do not have start or end point destinations within the United States. The number of people on the list rises and falls according to threat and intelligence reporting. There were 16,000 names on the list in 2011, 21,000 in 2012, and 47,000 in 2013. It also includes instructions for extra screening. False positives in the no-fly list are a huge issue. Some notable people have appeared on the no-fly list throughout the past 2 decades, including Senator Ted Kennedy, David Nelson from the TV series Ozzie and Harriet, Representative Don Young, and the musician Cat Stevens. Other examples of how people land on the list are very detailed and numerous and can't really be listed here within a podcast about a punk band, but the sources on this topic are endless. I found like a Ralph Nader campaign staff member was on the no-fly list for over 2 years. Kind of hard to be a national political advisor while being on the no-fly list, I would imagine. A Princeton professor named Walter Murphy landed on the list after giving a televised 2006 speech against Iraq, where he was very critical of George Bush and the very specific ways Bush had violated the Constitution. A veteran named Abe Marshall landed on the no-fly list after he emailed an imam for parenting advice that was being surveilled. So apparently he was offered the possibility of being removed from the list if he would become an informant. This is a very, very disturbing topic, which is, a recurring thing that we tend to dig up here on this podcast. But that's kind of what I was able to find just on this first term in this song.
Well, related to that, Greg, here's some info from the ACLU about no-fly lists, specifically kind of do's and don'ts. One thing I found says, if you are a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident placed on a no-fly list, the Department of Homeland Security Traveler Redress Inquiry Program will send you a letter informing you of your status on the no-fly list and providing the option to submit and receive additional information. And if you choose that option, the DHS will provide a second letter identifying the general criterion under which you have been placed on the no-fly list, and possibly including an unclassified summary of the reasons for your inclusion. It also says, the ACLU says, you should know that the government summary likely will not include all of its reasons for your placement on the list. And in some cases, the government will choose not to provide any summary at all. The government also will not provide you any of the evidence it relied upon in deciding to place you on the list. And it may also withhold information in its possession that undercuts its basis for putting you on the list. Finally, the government does not provide a live hearing at which you could testify or give an opportunity to cross-examine witnesses against you.
Yeah, and I was finding a lot of information on that as well. And in my digging, I came up with a comic strip called Grounded: Life on the No-Fly List by a political cartoonist named Jen Sorensen. Sorensen, her work has appeared in The Progressive, Miss Magazine, The Nation, Daily Kos, Medium, Alternate, and the Austin Chronicle. And in this comic, she talks about the uncertainty of how one lands on the no-fly list,
right?
The murky process of how to get your appeal submitted to the Department of Homeland Security Security Traveler Redress Inquiry Program, also known as DHS TRIP, to be removed from the no-fly list. And, there have been some recent reforms, and the government has now committed to telling U.S. citizens and permanent residents whether they are on the no-fly list or not. But I, in my mania in preparation for this podcast, I got Jen Sorensen on the phone, which is, how I roll here.
Yeah, amazing.
So I dug up some the contact info for the political cartoonist Jen Sorensen, shot her an email, and said, "Hey, I do a podcast about the band Propaganda. Would you be willing to do an interview about your research and into the no-fly list and creating the process of creating this political cartoon?"
Yeah.
About this list, which affects thousands of people who live in the US. And she said yes. So
cool.
I have an interview with Jen Sorensen that I would like to play now. What do you think about that, Keith?
A genuine unscripted moment.
Indeed. So this is my conversation with Jen Sorensen, political cartoonist whose work is a comic strip called Grounded: Life on the No-Fly List, which you can find if you Google it. So please enjoy this conversation on the no-fly list.
So much for your hopes and your dreams and your children. You just sat there believing in this bullshit system, just wishing the mob would magically come to its senses.
Jen Sorensen, welcome to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
It is a delight to have you here, especially since I just, found you on the internet and said, wow, this would be such a cool conversation to have. So I've been appreciating your work. But for those out there who don't know you, I'm wondering if you can just spend a moment and introduce yourself a little bit to the audience so they know who you are and kind of what you do.
Most people probably are familiar with my weekly cartoon that I've been doing for about 20 years now. I started out doing a comic in the alt weeklies. It used to be called Slowpoke, but I basically just go by my name nowadays. It really became more politicized during the George W. Bush years. Like a lot of cartoonists, I found it hard not to comment on everything that was happening during the Bush administration. And these days, my work appears on the Nib and Daily Kos, and I still run in various alt weeklies. But probably most people who do know my work, they probably see it on the Nib or someplace like that. I have also, over the years, done some advocacy comics for nonprofits. And so, like I've done some work for Kaiser Health News about health insurance for freelancers, which was a very important issue for me. And then the ACLU, after that, asked me to, I've done a couple pieces for them, did a comic about all the extreme new abortion laws, back, in the beginning of that. And of course, it's still happening. It's even getting much worse. And then, the comic that we were going to discuss soon about the no-fly list.
I'm a teacher and my co-host Keith is also a teacher. So we're always looking for resources to use within our own classrooms. And to me, political cartoons are one of the most accessible forms of disseminating information to young people. I've used comics in everything from my 10th grade English classes all the way to my philosophy and religious studies courses that I do with upperclassmen. And, one of the things that I'm curious about your thoughts is the purpose of political cartoons as a tool for education. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are as far as how you see what you do being an important educational tool for people in society.
That really resonates for me. And that does feel like what I'm trying to do, at least. And I do occasionally get these stories of, different professors or academics using my cartoons in their classrooms. And, most of the time, I think I just don't even know they're doing it. But, sometimes they'll contact me and ask for permission. And it's always such an honor to know that people are doing that. I guess there's sort of an activist component to political cartooning in that you're ideally, I think, trying to change the world and, make it a better place. There's so much bad news these days. That part can be demoralizing at times, but getting back to that educational mission, I feel like you can still share, share word of maybe news stories that people haven't heard about, or, plant a few seeds and get people thinking. So yeah, I would definitely say there's an educational part to it.
Well, Jen, you're here on a very random and niche podcast dedicated solely to the work of the Canadian band Propagandhi. And I was doing some research for a song of theirs called Note to Self, which contains a lyric about the no-fly list, which led me to your work because I found the awesome comic that you did for the ACLU that you mentioned called Grounded: Life on the No-Fly List, which came out in collaboration in 2014. And I would love to know more about the origin of this project and how your interest in the no-fly list developed as a result of this collaboration.
The ACLU proposed doing this story. It was around the time that they were in the midst of filing a lawsuit over the no-fly list. And the way it worked was they basically provided some information about the case and about the issues surrounding the no-fly list. A lot of the stuff is just available on their website. They gave me a lot of latitude to basically put that together into kind of an educational comic, letting people know in a very, I think, humanizing way, what it is that people are going through who are put on this list. Yeah, so I did this in 2014. We can talk about this a little bit later, but it was right before a federal judge ruled on the case. So I have to say I was very happy with how it came out, and I received some nice feedback from people who were actually on the no-fly list and who had been through this ordeal. And so that was very satisfying to know that I'd reached those people and that they were happy with it.
Awesome. I'm curious about the plot. There's a character within the story, within the panels of the comic, and I'm wondering about this particular story about how these characters came to be developed and everything like that. That kind of guides the piece.
And the character he's something of a composite, but he's definitely based on the experiences of real people. And there's one person in particular who I think who was a client of the ACLU's, who formed the basis, for this comic. I feel like I should begin by giving a little background on what the no-fly list is.
Yeah.
And So for people who aren't familiar with this, after 9/11, the FBI set up a something called the Terrorist Screening Database. And this was basically a huge list with very broad, vague language, just sort of a list of, potential terrorists. And from this, there was a subset that became the no-fly list. This no-fly list was shared with the TSA and Customs and Border Patrol and other countries. And this was all very secretive, especially at the time that I did the comic. People had no way of knowing if they were on the list or not. It was shrouded in mystery. We didn't really know how many people were on the list. Over the years, numbers have come out like 20,000, 47,000, pretty large number of people. So what would happen if, say like you would go to the airport, this was obviously like targeting many Muslim Americans and like permanent residents who they'd go to the airport and suddenly they'd be just surrounded by security. They couldn't fly. This one guy, it just ruined his ability to work, see his family. There's a lot of social stigma associated with it, like friends, don't want to be associated with you for fear of being on the no-fly list themselves. It really takes a toll on people when they can't fly and, obviously like they can't work, they can't see their family. So basically what people would do is, they could submit a form to the Department of Homeland Security and, asking for redress, saying like, what am I on this list? I would like, I've done nothing wrong. I'd like to be able to fly. And they would get this vague letter back that didn't even really confirm whether they were on the list or not. So people were just in limbo for years and it was just ruining their lives. And then in 2014, June of 2014, not long after the comic came out, a federal judge ruled that this was in fact unconstitutional. The fact that people couldn't challenge the decision and that they had no form of redress. So that there was a positive outcome, although there are still some issues.
This form, I'm like looking at the comic right now, and I see that whenever people submit an inquiry, the responses are just vague and basically doesn't answer the question, but it says that no changes are warranted at this time. So people just remain on it without ever actually getting an answer. Has that changed or developed at all? Has it gotten any better in the years since this came out?
So yeah, the system when it began was extremely Kafkaesque. And I believe what has happened since then is the government has to tell people if they're on the list, and there has been a revised system of redress where people can try to get, to clear their names. But according to the ACLU, there are still some problems that remain, such as people still can't find out why they've been put on the list, the reasons that they were blacklisted. And also, I guess there's still no longer, there's not a hearing before a neutral decision maker. So there's still not enough transparency here as to why people are on the list. And so I believe they are still, I've been checking up on how much, there really hasn't been a lot of news in recent years. There are a few stories of people, who are still encountering these problems and suing to get their names off the list. But it's still highly problematic.
You just mentioned how little it's actually mentioned. And that is something that I was noticing as well. I'll be like, wow, I really haven't thought about this in a while. And I felt like it almost became like a blind spot, like it's a convenient blind spot when the world is careening in so many directions, fighting for our attention, that this is the kind of subversive program that just kind of can exist in our day-to-day lives and have it affect it like tens of thousands of people, but we just don't think about it because all the other news just ricochets so quickly. Like this is like, I almost feel like this is like a really forgotten thing that we've just kind of let go because there's so many other things to worry about. Does that make sense?
Oh, exactly. And while I was working on this comic, I mean, even I was like, this is unbelievable. Like this stuff is happening and like no one's talking about it. I mean, it is being reported on by various journalistic outlets, but like so many stories, it just gets overshadowed by the other news stories, and it's just, it doesn't get talked about. It's not the sort of thing that trends on Twitter.
Yeah.
It happens in the shadows. There's not a lot of drama. Occasionally you'll get a report about it, but it's not video friendly. There's no viral video. But yeah, it's still kind of amazing that this stuff is happening. It's completely dysfunctional, really. I mean, it's like a dysfunctional aspect of the justice system.
Well, and your comic has a specific case that it refers to and what the ACLU is doing as far as lawsuits go. And I'm wondering what you remember about that as far as like how they have been instrumental in sort of fighting this thing that so many of us just completely ignore.
Right. Well, the case that came out in 2014, the one where they filed a lawsuit on behalf of 13 U.S. citizens and permanent residents, which is the one I mentioned, which, it was ruled on by a federal judge in Oregon in June of that year. And the judge did find the no-fly list unconstitutional. And I know that one of the main guys that was like a client of the ACLU that the story was based on, he did manage to finally clear his name and fly again and resume his life. And it definitely made a big difference in the lives of many people. I think a lot of questions remain about how the list is being abused these days. And I mean, there was a case that The Intercept wrote about, I guess a couple of years ago. There was a guy who, I guess he was a Pakistani student who came to America and went to college in the US. And then I believe that he was, the FBI tried to recruit him as an informant, and he did not want to participate. And the no-fly list was used as kind of a cudgel to punish him for not cooperating. It seems as though there are these, sort of alleged cases where people, they maybe target innocent people as part of, information gathering, and then, it's used as a way to coerce people into participating even when they don't. So it seems as though there are still problems that need to be addressed.
Gotcha. Are there any other parts of the creative process that you remember from this particular time making this particular piece that you haven't mentioned yet that you feel will be worth talking about at all? Like any other statistics or like interviews or anything like that that linger in your memory?
Well, let's see. I'm looking over the comic here. I guess one thing that I sort of like that I was able to do with this comic is just, it's an extremely serious and upsetting subject, but I did try to infuse the piece with just a little bit of humor, which I guess, I find humor to be more persuasive than just beating people over the head with arguments. Yes. Even as tempted as I am to do that constantly in my own work, I think that this piece actually has a few jokes.
Yeah.
Looking back, I'm like, wow, I actually managed to work some levity into this piece. So I'm kind of glad I was able to do that, because honestly, these days drawing comics, it's just so hard to laugh at the news these days. It's a real challenge.
Well, and you have that mischievous nature sort of in common with the band Propaganda. They have a lot of humor woven throughout their years and years of lyrics that have poked fun at many things. So you sort of have that in common with them, which is wonderful. Let's chat about Propaganda for just a second, because I'm curious about your thoughts on the fact that you're on a podcast specifically about one band, and I'm curious about your knowledge of them in any way, because I know that you have an interest in music and going to shows and stuff like that. So I'm curious about your knowledge of this band, or if I have just foisted you into this mysterious brand new universe.
So I have always, I've been going to shows since I was a teenager, and like I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and we had this great little club called the Chameleon Club where all these bands would come through. And I, like very early on, I remember, seeing Fugazi, and I kind of grew up in that period of,
holy smokes, that's awesome.
And then I guess I came to really love just some of those old British punk bands like the Buzzcocks and and the Damned, and I got really into that scene, and I got to see the Ramones in the 90s. I'm very, very
amazing.
proud to say Joey was still alive.
Yeah.
But and I was like a college DJ, but even though I have heard of Propaganda for decades now, and I'm pretty sure that I have heard them on various community radio stations over the years, but for some reason I've never quite had the opportunity to dive deeper into their work. And so I like what I've heard, and so you've piqued my curiosity.
Wonderful. I mean, if I can make a new fan out of you for Propaganda, I would. Did you get a chance to check out Note to Self, the song for the episode?
Yes, I did. And well, first I want to say Failed States is a great name for an album.
Yes.
And I love that album cover too.
Yeah.
So and I like that. I guess it's sort of a more metal sound, at least to Note to Self. I haven't checked out the whole album yet, but I'm kind of, my husband is something of a metalhead, and so I'm totally into the heavy guitar. So the song Note to Self, I'm gonna bring up the lyrics here.
Yeah, please do.
So checking out the lyrics of Note to Self. So it starts right off mentioning the no-fly list.
Mm-hmm.
No fly list, no drive list, no walk list, no talk list, no muckraking journalist left to take stock of the wholesale omission of outside perspectives. For me, this really speaks to the I guess the feeling I had working on this comic, that this is a very underreported story and an underdiscussed story, and that does kind of, it is like an omission of outside perspectives. I mean, it's not that journalism completely failed to talk about it, but obviously it's a bigger story than the attention that it received.
Yeah.
And so I think that first stanza really makes a lot of sense to me. And then then it goes on. How does it make you feel to know that you voted for this? The thing is, like, people, it seems like most Americans, they have no idea that they voted for this at all, or voted, I think, so it speaks to this basically just obliviousness and ignorance. It's like it's a failure of the system itself.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what they're getting at.
Yeah. Well, and you are in journalism. So the song also talks about the fact that, like, eventually maybe there won't be people who are doing the kind of work that you do, which is highlighting injustices, and that will make our society even worse,
Right. So when they say no muckraking journalists left, I think that also speaks to the decline of newspapers. And I mean, that is such a tragedy, especially local newspapers. I mean, without any local news, I mean, you have these vast parts of the country that are now news deserts.
Right.
People are getting their information from Facebook and Fox News, which is just like pure disinformation these days.
Yeah.
And so, but the fact that like journalism is falling prey to, I mean, there's so many different ways in which it's stressed right now between, like Facebook and technology companies kind of like taking eyeballs away from news outlets to, just the hedge fundification of newspapers, like they're just being bought up by hedge funds and kind of like stripped for parts. And then the alt weeklies, which I, really got my start in, and I feel like that's my home. So many of them have gone out of business. I still am, I still run in a bunch of papers that seem to be the ones that like stayed independent and small, and they're like locally owned, and they still operate out of a sense of community rather than just trying to make money, which you really can't do. It's not like a wise, it's not a good way to make money, really. Weekly newspaper. I think that line certainly it addresses the crisis we have in journalism of just newsrooms and reporters not being funded.
Well, and I think I was listening to an interview recently with Timothy Snyder, who wrote that book on tyranny. And he was talking about how that exact problem about the news deserts, where when you have local news organizations that shut down, those people are no longer in the community talking to people saying, oh yeah, I'm writing this story about this, or, oh, I'm making this segment for the evening broadcast on the local news for this day. So local people stop communicating with people who are actually doing journalism professionally. And then so all of your news comes from elsewhere, which then Snyder says leads to the rise of what becomes known as the media in the negative connotation manner. Does that make sense? So like when you take away the people in the community who are actually doing that work, then everything comes from elsewhere. And then it is met with suspicion also.
Right. I think it doesn't help the distrust people have in that the sense of distrust that has grown over the years. Of course, that has been basically exacerbated and manipulated by. I mean, there's as part of a game plan is to discredit the media as a monolithic entity, basically, and there's still a lot of, I think, very well-meaning and decent reporters out there, but certainly doesn't help. That sense of just a corporate colossus kind of speaking to you, it's not the same as your local local gumshoe journalist, just reporting on the streets. I will say that the one bright spot, and it's a very small bright spot, but there has been kind of an uptick in community-supported journalism. So like nonprofit publications covering local news. Some of the papers that used to be out weeklies are now transforming into local nonprofit journalism. It seems to be a somewhat more sustainable business model, at least these days. Unfortunately, I think you don't get some of the arts coverage and the underground culture that you used to get in alt weeklies. Like they don't tend to run comics as much. But there are, I think probably the future of journalism in the US, if there is a future at all, is going to be that more nonprofit model, which is probably, good for the, overall, it's good in terms of like what gets reported.
Sure.
Not just catering to like what sells.
Sure. Do you have any other thoughts on like any of the rest of the lyrics? Does anything else jump out at you on this one? Because there's a little bit more that comes after that, but this is not a super lyrically dense song.
Right. Well, I guess as it goes on, the song kind of broadens out to just the entire, entire failed system. So it ends with like, when the cops and the courts refuse to confess the sins of a few, what is there left to do? The answer is there right before your eyes. Rise. So that I guess is that is addressing the broader issue of like when you have especially I think the justice system, that we have seen in recent years is so dysfunctional in so many ways. The song's calling for people to rise up, and how that would look, I don't know exactly.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. And like asks us to, continue to hope for a better future, because if there is no hope for a better future, then what's the point in rising? So to me, it's like this bleak picture of what is going on in multiple aspects of our society, but then it continues to ask us to continue to have hope and to fight for something a little better. So even though the song is very bleak and dark to me, there's like that note of hope at the end.
It's not saying just to throw in the towel.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, did you like the song, Jen? Was it an enjoyable experiment for you to chat about it?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome.
And like I said, I kind of dig the metal sound.
Awesome. Well,
it's expanding my horizons a little bit.
I'm so glad. And now that I know that you and your partner both enjoy some heavier sounds, like I said, I do think that you should continue your exploration and propaganda in the coming weeks, because there's a lot of great stuff there that can make you think, and they've made a difference in a lot of people's lives the world over. So I'm just delighted to be able to have you as part of this project to chat about a very niche section of this song, because the song is about a lot more than just like the topic that I invited you to talk about. But as you can see, like it's like an Easter egg that just opens up and you can dive deeper into it. That's what this band does for me. And I love that our little conversation could go those different directions whenever you're just kind of finding out about the band. Like they're powerful to me.
Yeah. And reading up about the band and sort of checking out their press photos. I mean, I don't know. They just seem, there's something about them that feels very, that I feel like I can, relate to. And I guess they brought in a female guitarist a few years ago, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Sulin's been on the podcast several times at this point. So if you wanted to hear interviews with Sulin, they are sporadically placed within the episodes, and I can tell you the episode numbers at another time. Like, yeah, Sulin rules for sure. Well, Jen, just so that listeners can find you, I'm wondering if you have any links or anything that you would like to direct listeners' attention to if they would like to follow your work more from here on out after getting to know you a little bit today.
Sure. Well, probably the easiest way to find out about me would be to go to my website, which is jensorensen.com. And that's Sorensen with an S-E-N at the end. Very frequently misspelled, but should be able to find it. And, that probably will give you everything you need to know about where to find my work. And,
wonderful.
My Twitter feed and everything else.
Well, Jen Sorensen, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely wonderful time to chat about your work. I was delighted to find your comic, Grounded: Life on the No-Fly List, which is at aclu.org's website. And I just really liked this conversation. I'm just so glad that you're willing to do this with me and to, have a kind of a unique podcast experience for a very niche audience.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to listening to the whole episode.
Dazed, numb, powerless, stunned, while we...
So thank you again to Jen Sorensen. We have so many guests on this episode, so many guests. This opening line of the song, Keith, it reminds me of how so many of the policies nations enact in the name of safety, which prey upon our worst fears of becoming victims ourselves, go squarely against the post-World War II United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. So many of the people who land on surveillance lists fit specific racial and religious demographics, but the second article of the Declaration is that everyone is entitled to all rights and freedoms, regardless of color, sex, language, religion, nationality, or political opinion. And Article 7 states that everyone has the right to equal protection before the law, yet people on surveillance lists aren't told why they landed on a list a lot of the time, which, we've talked about, but which also violates Article 9 about arbitrary detention and exile, and Article 10 about fair tribunal and hearing, and Article 13 guarantees freedom of movement, yet people are mistakenly and purposefully prevented from movement all of the time, which is something we've also talked about in like the Fuck the Border episode. But, the illusion of freedom is a rallying cry so often in countries, especially this country, but the readiness with which it is taken is pretty striking.
Yeah, I'm so thankful that you thought of it in terms of the Declaration of Human Rights and pointing out the absurdity here. And Greg, something I never considered until now was another detail I found from the ACLU. Like U.S. citizens have a right under the 14th Amendment to return to U.S. territory after traveling abroad.
Mm-hmm.
And lawful permanent residents have a similar right to return to U.S. territory under the Immigration and Nationality Act. Therefore, when a U.S. citizen or permanent resident is denied boarding in a foreign country due to apparent inclusion on the no-fly list, the U.S. government must help them secure approval to return to the U.S. via commercial flight. So the government may not use the no-fly list to prevent U.S. citizens or permanent residents from returning home to U.S. territory. And I also recommend checking out from the ACLU how to get home. There are details I won't get into here, but how to get home if you've been denied boarding outside of the U.S. And Greg, you provided some really important context on no-fly lists. And with the rest of the lyrics, no drive list, no walk list, no talk list, I think the band does a great job here asking you, like, where do you draw the line in rights being restricted, movement being controlled, that if the TSA and other government agencies actually worked well to do their jobs, we wouldn't need to have these restrictive lists, which end up just violating people's rights for the illusion of safety.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we've got who's exposing that, right? So we've got this next line: no muckraking journalists left to take stock of the wholesale omission of outside perspectives. And this line got me really into some dark stuff. It got me digging into freedom of the press around the world. And when I poke through what is known as the World Press Freedom Index, which reports on state control of available news within a country, there are 180 ranked countries in the world on this list. Just to state right off the bat, as of 2021's rankings, the top 6 were Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Costa Rica, and the Netherlands. And then Jamaica comes in 7th. But Canada is number 14. The UK is 33rd. France is 34th. And the US is 44th, just behind Taiwan. And the bottom 4 are China, Turkmenistan, North Korea, and Eritrea. Last year, Russia was 150th, but I bet they will plummet farther this next round of rankings for 2022 for extremely obvious reasons. But the Press Freedom Index, published at Reporters Without Borders, reports press freedom is totally blocked or seriously impeded in 73 countries and constrained in 59 others, which together represent 73% of the countries evaluated. But these countries are classified as having very bad, or problematic environments for press freedom and are identified accordingly in black, red, or orange on the World Press Freedom app. But what was wild was the degree to which the global health crisis in 2020 through 2022 impacted the freedom of information available to people. So, for example, President Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, which is ranked 111th on the Press Freedom Index, and President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, which is at 148th, promoted medically unproven remedies for the pandemic, right? In Iran, which is at 174th. The authorities tightened their control over news coverage and stepped up trials of journalists in order to weaken the media's ability to scrutinize the country's death toll from the pandemic. And in Egypt, at 166th, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's government banned the publication of any pandemic statistics that didn't come from the Ministry of Health. And in Zimbabwe, which is at 130th, the investigative reporter Hopewell Chinono was arrested shortly after helping to expose the overbilling practices of a medical equipment supply company. And in 2021, only 12 of the index's 180 countries, which is only 7%, can claim to offer a favorable environment for journalism, as opposed to 13 countries at 8% in 2020. So Germany was also stripped of its classification, of its good classification, because dozens of journalists were attacked by supporters of extremist and conspiracy theory believers during protests against pandemic restrictions. So the bottom ranked, the extremes of which at China at 177th continue to take internet censorship, surveillance, and propaganda to unprecedented levels. And the lowest ranked countries maintain absolute control over all news and information, enabling some countries to claim they had no pandemic cases and to conceal fates of imprisoned journalists. So whenever we talk about this no muckraking journalist left to take stock of the wholesale, the omission of wholesale outside perspectives, this is not theoretical. I was listening to an interview recently with Timothy Snyder, author of On Tyranny, who talked at length about why news is also so hard to process for so many Americans, because we have a news problem in this country. And in the last decade, there's been a gutting of local newspapers, which led to fewer interactions in towns of local writers covering local events, and led to a rise in what is known as the disparaging term, the media. So even though the U.S. is in about the top quarter, it has a massive distrust issue, because for many people, journalism is what is coming out of New York City. And when journalist has no direct involvement in the life of a specific community, the rise in suspicion seems to be the corresponding result. So we have this problem here as well.
Oh, absolutely. And distilling that down to a single image, like an anecdote from last week, I saw a middle-aged guy at the grocery store with a t-shirt that said defund the media, which like kind of similar to the fuck Biden flags.
Yeah,
like,
let's
I
go,
agree.
Brandon.
Yeah, like I agree, but for different reasons. My concerns regarding the media being corporate influence and feedback loops and headlines and clickbait and the focus on sound bites and the lack of context and what feels like an absence of mainstream journalists who hold politicians and others accountable. Just recently there was a viral clip of the British journalist Mark Stone grilling Ted Cruz about gun control laws. And I think that's an example of what I'd like to see more from, American journalists. So this is a tricky thing. You touched on the suspicion many Americans have about the media. It's hard to talk about because America's divestment from local media, from critical news sources that expose corruption, has had this devastating consequence on what we hear, read, and see. And at the same time, like right-wing politicians have maligned the media in such inflammatory ways, instilling not just, a healthy level of skepticism, right, but something far worse to their cultish followers, an active mistrust toward journalists, which often leads to hostility. So I read some findings from the press freedoms in 2020 report. And in 2020, journalists and news organizations across the US faced record numbers of physical attacks, arrests, and cases of equipment damage, as well as many other press freedom violations. And some other takeaways include that police were responsible for the vast majority of attacks on journalists and appeared to frequently target them at Black Lives Matter protests. Journalists also faced 15 times as many arrests as the previous year. Subpoenas reported to the tracker increased for the third consecutive year, and journalists were denied access to a wide range of traditionally open government events, often in apparent retaliation for their questions or their coverage. And no surprise, former President Donald Trump accelerated his attacks on journalists in his last year in office. So the criticism of the media, I think, is necessary, and it fits, and I think it just depends on how you're talking about it, but it also fits in with a quote from Hedges that was included in like the lyric video and in the liner notes. And his main arguments, for example, in Death of the Liberal Class and Wages of Rebellion, that institutions that previously served democracy, liberalism, the rule of law, by exposing injustice and corruption, have been so thoroughly defanged, disenfranchised, and divested from that journalists, if previously truthsayers that we relied upon, are now silenced, or they're left out of mainstream conversations, or they're ridiculed, smeared, or actually attacked. And just to give some context for those who might be familiar with the term muckraker, like one of the most, probably the most famous examples of muckrakers would be the socialist Upton Sinclair, specifically his novel The Jungle, which was an expose of the brutal impacts of capitalism in the meatpacking industry. But others include Lincoln Stevens, who published an article in McClure's magazine called Tweed's Last Day in St. Louis, which exposed how city officials worked in league with big business to maintain power while corrupting the public treasury. Just after Lincoln Stevens launched his assault on urban politics, Ida Tarbell began her McClure series entitled History of the Standard Oil Company, which outlined and documented the cutthroat business practices behind John Rockefeller's rise. In 1905, Thomas Lawson brought the inner workings of the stock market to light in Frenzied Finance. John Spargo unearthed the horrors of child labor in The Bitter Cry of the Children in 1906. David Phillips linked 75 different senators to big business interests in The Treason of the Senate. In 1907, William Hard went public with industrial accidents in the steel industry, in the blistering Making Steel and Killing Men. And Ray Stannard Baker revealed the oppression of Southern blacks in Following the Color Line in 1908.
Man.
So like there were like these gains of the progressive era, which seemed to be rolled back further by like the hidden effects of what Sheldon Walden, a scholar that Hedges references a lot, what Sheldon Walden refers to as inverted totalitarianism, which you can read an article of the same name in The Nation. And I'm going to read a couple quotes from that article from Sheldon Walden to describe what this means in inverted totalitarianism. He says, I want to go further and name the emergent political system inverted totalitarianism. By inverted, I mean that while the current system and its operatives share with Nazism the aspiration toward unlimited power and aggressive expansionism, their methods and actions seem upside down. For example, in Weimar Germany, before the Nazis took power, the streets were dominated by totalitarian-oriented gangs of toughs. And whatever there was of democracy was confined to the government. In the United States, however, it is the streets where democracy is most alive, while the real danger lies with an increasingly unbridled government. He then goes on to say, thus the elements are in place: a weak legislative body, a legal system that is both compliant and repressive, a party system in which one party, whether in opposition or in the majority, is bent upon reconstituting the existing system so as to permanently favor a ruling class of the wealthy, the well-connected, and the corporate, while leaving the poorer citizens with a sense of helplessness and political despair, and at the same time keeping the middle classes dangling between fear of unemployment and expectations of fantastic rewards once the new economy recovers. That scheme is abetted by a sycophantic and increasingly concentrated media, by the integration of universities with their corporate benefactors, by a propaganda machine institutionalized in well-funded think tanks and conservative foundations, by the increasingly closer cooperation between local police and national law enforcement agencies aimed at identifying terrorists, suspicious aliens, and domestic dissidents.
Oh boy.
Hedges in his writing describes how progressives and communists went to FDR with a simple message: respond with substantive reform or you will get revolution. But FDR's response was to cater to oligarchs, warning them to give away some of their money or that they would lose all of their money. And this led to the creation of millions of jobs, Social Security, public works, libraries, post offices, piecemeal reforms that maintained the oligarchs' wealth and power, and institutions that have since been thoroughly disenfranchised and defunded. So the totalitarianism is everywhere and it's nowhere.
It's crazy.
It makes it harder to fight than, say, a single party, a single strongman, or a single ideology. It is the tendrils of corporate power enveloping, constricting, and restricting everything.
Yeah. And like the intentions of how something like a university would begin, right?
Right.
Like the intentions would be so good, but then over time it just gets eaten away and crumbled until you have, students at an in-state university paying like, $15,000 a year in tuition, while like, a new like hundreds of millions of dollars football stadium gets built on the exact same campus while students are drowning in debt. It's like just this gross, makes it kind of sick to your stomach to think about all the ways that, that these things have gone wrong. Ugh. Well, Keith, how does it make you feel to know that you voted for this?
Oh man, that's such a punch, right?
Yeah, it really is. It's so effectively placed in the song too. Like this is a question for every hold your nose voter. I think I feel like I'll just be speaking into an echo chamber here with propaganda fans, but this song came out during the Obama presidency, which is important to remember pre-Trump, but we all remember the hope and change rah-rah of Obama. I think of the work of like Jeremy Scahill here, who wrote a book about drone and clandestine warfare called Dirty Wars. And in that book, I'll never forget, reading the story of how a U.S. citizen named Anwar al-Awlaki was targeted by the U.S. and how his son Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki was also killed by the U.S. in an undeclared act of war in Yemen and ordered by Obama in 2011. And like the kid was 16 and he was killed 2 weeks after his father was killed. And like in 2017, Abdul Rahman's 8-year-old sister was killed in a drone strike ordered by Trump. And like, these are like publicized examples. And I'm just like, so much like public taxpayer money goes into death in this country, which is like, trying to proclaim itself to be some kind of pro-life country. And, this reminded me of when I was listening back to Chris's Rock for Sustainable Capitalism episode as well on his Catastrophic Break with Consensus Reality podcast, where he talks about the waning days of the Trump presidency. And it makes me feel as if he has compassion for the impossible choices basically all of us are forced into if we wish to vote. And I'll never forget being at a record store in 2016, the day after the election, and how I was talking to the store manager about how I wasn't surprised by the result. And the other clerk was like, I can't believe you guys even bother with that nonsense. It doesn't matter. And I got so angry because a tiny kernel of truth in that, because when you assess the power of a single vote in a place like California versus the vote in a place like Wyoming,
Right,
like
right.
a per capita basis in the electoral college system of how a voting district or for the House of Representatives basically makes about as much sense as like a sunspot on the top of some bald dude's head, the layers of how like seemingly little power a single person has can become overwhelming. But then once in a while, a tiny ray of light will shine through to make me feel like maybe someday something good can happen and someone who actually cares about people will sneak through. And it's like, that's what voting here feels like.
Mhm.
Is it's like these like tiny kernels of hope happen just often enough to make me not give up entirely. Ugh.
Yeah, Greg, I think I've realized that most of my votes have been voting against something else
Yeah.
rather than voting
For
for
someone.
something that
Yeah.
I wholly support.
Right.
And that's probably an obvious statement. But
Yeah.
even in 2012, despite the fact that I was, listening to Democracy Now! Or reading Cornel West's criticisms of Obama, like I was still in this very, naive
Mhm.
or sheltered or ignorant.
All of those. I mean,
all of those things.
And it's
like,
not wrong to admit that either. I
Yeah.
feel exactly the same way.
like still watching The Daily Show and thinking like this will provide me answers, right? And realizing how much I got wrong about, and knowing a lot of it in the time that was wrong, but holding my nose, or realizing, well, hey, at least it's not X, right? Fill in the blank.
Yeah.
But there's been almost this realization that if my vote really doesn't matter, which I don't think it does, why not just use it for then what I actually support?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's taken too long to realize. And maybe each time this whole charade of like, well, if this, then that, and that is how, like this continues to trudge on, and spineless Democrats continue to like fear monger their way into just enough power that they don't use anyway.
Yeah.
Right. Then why do I continue to empower those who do not enact the change that people want? So
Yeah. And
it's not easy.
And they get
to make sense
paid
of.
and they get paid to not enact it. They get paid,
Right.
Members of the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate are very handsomely compensated, which, you and I are both raising children. And so Chris brings out this next gut punch: so much for your hopes and your dreams and your children. And, my kid never asked to be born. You know what I mean? She didn't ask for this. She didn't ask to be here, and now she's here. And I'm just like, existence, I fundamentally believe, is a stroke of luck that is so almost impossible to fathom. The fact that we're all here talking about these things is like simply still incredible to me. But man, I think about this line so often, and I know that the band seems to also. Like, I have one kid whom I love dearly with all my heart, but man, that the last several years haven't been truly an endless parade of evidence that maybe having a big family is a terrible idea. The idea that I'll be dead and my kid could become a climate refugee is enough to make me just want to scream. But then we've had the pandemic, the total obsession with going back normal in our society, even though we could have radically altered some ways of operating, but also just the recent news of the curtailing of rights of women in this country. And I just am like, I have a daughter, and apparently, and like the endless school shootings and shootings in public, the shooting here in Buffalo, 2 miles from my house is when that shooting in Buffalo happened. And I'm just like, I have no belief that things will be any better when I'm at the end of my life than they are now. Like, it's like, this is just like a slow motion tragedy instead of a slow motion success story. And yeah, it really messes with my head, this line, so much for your hopes and your dreams and your children, you know.
The last week of school, I got out at the very end of May, and after the Buffalo shooting and the shooting in Texas, I really thought on this idea of, does our society in the US as it stands now, like, are the benefits worth the consequences? Like, are the upsides worth the downsides? And is there really, like, can I not just disconnect from everything and shelter my child from the rest of this awful garbage that's around us everywhere,
dude?
And I really don't think that what is being offered is worth it. You know, but I also don't have the ability or capability or the financial or like just the, you know, what everything else that would be needed to just like, all right, we're moving out off the grid into the woods, whatever. Like, I can't do that. I don't know how to do that, but I admit that it would be better.
Yeah. You know, and Keith, you and I are surrounded by people who live near us who would literally look at the body of a 5-year-old torn apart by a semi-automatic rifle in their classroom, and people that your neighbors, my neighbors also, would look at a bullet-riddled body of a kindergartner, and they would come up with a spirited defense on behalf of the semi-automatic rifle. Like, that would be their automatic reaction, would be to come up with a spirited and, in their mind, rationally based argument in defense of that piece of hardware. And I'm like, well, so much for my hopes and my dreams and my children, because I am surrounded by absolutely pathological maniacs.
Yeah, man. The thought of putting my kids in the public school, you know, and not because of teachers or curriculum or whatever, but because of our inability to value human life and to protect children.
Yeah.
You know, which does not go back to, you know, Sandy Hook. I mean, let's look at the history of indigenous people and chattel slavery and the exploitation of child labor. And, you know, like it is like throughout American history to devalue and to massacre children. So this is not within like the last 10 years. So this, I don't know. I don't have an answer, but it feels just inescapable.
To me, this is what we are. Like, to me, like, killing is like just as American as baseball and hot dogs, man. Like, I don't really know about the origin of hot dogs, honestly. I'm probably, you know, just totally wrong in that regard, but baseball and burgers, man, to me, murder and killing is just as American as those things. And, you know, we have this, as the next line says, we sat there believing in this bullshit system where every couple of years, this like parade of rich people are paraded in front of the cameras with their massive campaign war chests, making a bunch of promises about what they're going to do and how the other side is so terrible. And then we keep sitting there watching kids get killed and, watching our election access get dismantled and watching the Supreme Court gut women's rights and gut the ability to, sue the police for police brutality and things like that. Like I said, peeling back the layers of the system, especially the voting system, is really an exercise in despair. Like, none of this leads to me having a good day thinking about this stuff. And when we were getting ready for this song, I was thinking about I remembered a 2014 study I read by a Princeton professor named Martin Gillens and a Northwestern professor named Benjamin Page, who concluded that the United States is an oligarchy, not a democracy. And, whenever I read this for the first time, I was like figuring all this stuff out. We're talking about 8 years ago now. So I was like 30. And that likely receives a resounding duh from listeners of this podcast, right. But which aren't necessarily echoed across large swaths of society. You go talk to some random person in society. Did you know that the U.S. is more of an oligarchy than a democracy? And they're going to be like, what, dude? I'm like waiting for my lunch. Like, shut up. But in the U.S., wealthy few move policy, while you and I do not, basically. Mm-hmm. And Gillens and Page found that when a majority of citizens disagree with economic elites and or with organized interests, they generally lose. So moreover, because of the strong status quo built into the U.S. political system, even when fairly large majorities of Americans favor policy change, which you alluded to earlier, they generally don't get that policy change. So 80% of Americans could be in favor of something and we still wouldn't get it. You know what I mean?
Right.
And Americans do enjoy many features central to democratic governance, such as regular elections, freedom of speech and association, and a widespread, if still contested, franchise. But we believe that if policymaking is dominated by powerful business organizations and a small number of affluent Americans, then America's claim to being a democratic society is seriously threatened. So that's Gillen Page, right? And to me, what this means is that the breadcrumbing of small things here and there are given to us to pacify our desire to believe we have a say in the system. Mm-hmm. And just enough evidence will trickle to us, our lowly selves, right? To make us think we can do something to make our society a better place. If we just work together, we're going to make a better place. So we're like breadcrumbed into believing with these little kernels that if we just keep working hard and collaborating, that we can do something better. But we are so slammed with just the basics of trying to pay rent or a mortgage or property taxes or homeowners insurance or cell phone bills or the internet or gas and electric costs, grocery bills, childcare, vet bills, medical debt, etc., that we are so exhausted into submission, into saying, well, I guess it could be worse. Like, at the end of the day, after I deal with all that crap I just listed, I'm like so tired that all I can do is stare at the floor, and that's when we accept our fate, basically, and we accept the oligarchic reality of our society because we're so freaking tired from dealing with the things. And I feel like our exhaustion is by design. Right. Mm-hmm. So many of our companies do not need for us to commute into the office anymore, yet all of them are demanding that we do so. So people are getting back in their cars and they're traveling their 30 miles into the freaking office in the morning and sitting in gridlock for an hour and a half one way. And they get to their office and they're just totally drained. But so check this out, dude. You know how I do crazy stuff for this podcast? I found Jen Sorensen and interviewed her about no-fly lists. Well, I wrote to Benjamin Page, the author of that study.
Get out of here.
And I said, hi, Dr. Page. My name is Greg, and I'm looking over your 2014 study about how the U.S. is an oligarchy, not a democracy. I'm just a normal person without a terminal degree in these fields, but I find it all fascinating. This struck me. Quote, multivariate analysis indicates that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence, end quote. Is there any sign for hope on this front since the study was released in 2014, or have things only continued to escalate? I realize this is a complicated question, but I'm curious. Thanks, Greg. And he replied, so this is from Dr. Ben Page from Northwestern University. Dear Greg, things are looking bad to me, but history sometimes comes up with pleasant surprises, like the People's Party and progressives at the beginning of the 20th century. Who knows? A big social movement could do it. And there are some signs that such a movement may be forming. Ben Page. So that was kind of fun to write to the person who wrote the article about how the US is more of an oligarchy than a democracy. But I enjoyed that little interaction because I enjoyed his work. So I would encourage anybody out there, if you ever read something that you really enjoy, you should find the person and tell them that you enjoyed it, because it keeps them inspired and hungry to release those kinds of things for us to continue to think about the future of our society. So anyway, that was kind of a fun little project that I went on to dig into that oligarchy versus democracy stuff.
Yeah, Greg, I've mentioned before that there's like a great personal challenge to teaching history and government for me, especially like the state standards that purport our governmental system to be the greatest achieved by mankind, which it's clearly a closed system that seeks to maintain wealth and power with the illusion of democratic control and influence. Chris Hedges also writes, the citizen has become irrelevant. He or she can participate in heavily choreographed elections.
Yes.
But the demands of corporations and banks are paramount. And I actually found that same study.
I was wondering if you would, and I was so glad that you did.
And it was only from a student. A student of mine brought this up to me last school year, and he mentioned it in class, and I was like, Eli, can you email me that?
Yeah.
He emailed me the article.
Dude, it was a big paper, man. I'm glad you read it too, because I loved that paper when it came out, and I read it again in preparation for this. And I was like, this is so good.
Yeah. And I've been sitting on it, like kind of like, oh, okay, this is something I'm going to have to make reference to.
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh, I have to go back to that.
Did you email Ben Page though, is the question?
I did not, but I do plan on telling Eli that I am going to, thank him in a podcast episode. So I want to break down a couple of things that stood out to me from that.
Awesome.
You touched on it already. So, I mean, basically just picture a simple line graph, the X axis representing public support for an issue or legislation, like being 0% to 100%, and the Y axis representing likelihood that Congress will pass laws that reflect the will of the people, also being 0% to 100%. So in like a real democracy, the graph would look pretty much like a diagonal 45-degree line, just going up to the right. So if, 60% of the people supported some change, then there would be a 60% chance of it becoming law and it passing. I mean, clearly we do not live in a true democracy. But even worse than that, the findings are just, we're still startling. I mean, I already had a cynical view of things to begin with, but being supported by research and 20 years of data, just was like, I didn't know it was this bad. So legislation that has zero support from the populace has about a 30% chance of becoming federal law.
Of course.
A law with 100% support, a theoretical, issue, 100% support from the American people, also has a 30% chance of becoming a law. And the number of voters, therefore, for or against a law has no impact on whether or not Congress actually passes a bill.
Disgusting.
A quote is that the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy.
That makes 100% sense to me, because that's exactly how I see my votes. Like,
Right.
I just like, this is, I don't know what's going to happen. But I know it's probably not going to be anything that I would envision as being a better future. So that line just hits me exactly where my feelings are.
Right. But the study also found that elite representation, the wealthy, corporate interests, and lobbyists have their own line. And the study found that this line looks a lot closer to that, like up and to the right 45-degree diagonal line in a true democracy, that the government is far more likely to pass legislation that reflects the will and wishes of elites than the people, because purchasing political influence through lobbyists is not only legal, but it is the norm for both parties. I mean, in the early 2010s, the 200 most politically active corporations in the US spent $5.8 billion influencing the government, but they received $4.4 trillion in taxpayer subsidies. And these trends predate the 2010 Supreme Court ruling on Citizens United, the decision overruling an earlier court decision, Austin versus Michigan State Chamber of Commerce, that allowed prohibitions on independent expenditures by corporations. So those Citizens United exacerbated an already undemocratic, plutocratic oligarchy masquerading itself as a free society. Like, things have only gotten worse. So I have another quote from Hedges here from Wages of Rebellion, in which he said, "Speculators, meanwhile, have seized control of the global economy and the levers of political power. They have weakened and emasculated governments to serve their lust for profit. They have turned the press into courtiers, corrupted the courts, and hollowed out public institutions, including universities. They peddle spurious ideologies, neoliberal economics, and globalization to justify their rapacious looting and greed. They create grotesque financial mechanisms, from usurious interest rates on loans to legalized accounting fraud, to plunge citizens into crippling forms of debt peonage. And they have been stealing staggering sums of public funds, such as the $65 billion of mortgage-backed securities and bonds, many of them toxic, that have been unloaded each month on the Federal Reserve in return for cash. They feed like parasites off the state and the resources of the planet. Speculators at mega banks and investment firms, such as Goldman Sachs, are not, in a strict sense, capitalists. They do not make money from the means of production. Rather, they ignore or rewrite the law ostensibly put in place to protect the weak from the powerful, to steal from everyone, including their own shareholders. They produce nothing. They make nothing. They only manipulate money.
Oh, gross.
They are no different from the detested speculators who were hanged in the 17th century when speculation was a capital offense. The obscenity of their wealth is matched by their utter lack of concern for the growing numbers of the destitute. In early 2014, the world's 200 richest people made $13.9 billion in one day, according to Bloomberg's Billionaires Index. This hoarding of money by the elites, according to the ruling economic model, is supposed to make us all better off. But in fact, the opposite happens when wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few individuals and corporations. As economist Thomas Piketty documents in his book, Capital in the 21st Century, the rest of us have little or no influence over how we are governed, and our wages stagnate or decline. Underdeployment and unemployment become chronic. Social services, from welfare to Social Security, are slashed in the name of austerity. Government, in the hands of speculators, is a protection racket for corporations and a small group of oligarchs. And the longer we play by their rules, the more impoverished and oppressed we become.
Hedges comes up later in this record in Things I Like. I like how Hedges tells it like it is. So all of us in this country are playing along to this to some degree, right? So we're the mob. So we have this next line, just wishing the mob would magically come to its senses. How does it make you feel to know you just stood by and watched it? And I have no idea what to do other than to just try to be a positive effect and influence on the people in my immediate vicinity. My influence in that regard is much, much lower than it used to be. Like when I had your job, like doing the job that you're doing, like in a public school classroom itself, like I felt like I, could actually be around people and do these kinds of things all day, but it's so exhausting. It got to the point where I was just so fried and burnt out. So now all my teaching is like online, and the amount of people that I actually come into contact with is like tiny compared to what it used to be just a few short years ago. So while I wish that I could be more of an influence, I suppose, on people around me, I just don't really come into contact with that many people on any given day. And I'm like, man, am I just like missing lots of opportunities to be a part of good things? But, I also wish that our leadership was equally committed to ensuring the power of the future. Like I read that book, The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And I listened to an interview that Ezra Klein did in an episode of his podcast, November 2020. Chris Hanna also recommended to his Patreon subscribers, and which Kim Stanley Robinson himself discussed on episode 42 of the Planetary Regeneration podcast with Gregory Landua. But the amount of profits to be made at the highest echelons of society by things that will destroy civilization won't be stopped anytime soon. And so like wishing the mob would magically come to its senses. I feel like so many people in the mob have very much come to their senses. But like when you talk about how 100% of the mob could come to its senses, and we have a 30% chance of having, like legislation passed that 100% of us would agree on, that is not okay, because what that requires is for that 100% to, upend many of the institutions that have, sort of been like the backbone of like, kind of been around for a long time. And I'm not defending really like institutions per se, because like you mentioned earlier, the history of this country is so bloody, but like it's also like we've been told to believe in all these things. So unprogramming my own belief that these things could be used for the right purposes is just, it's a head trip of epic proportions of rethinking everything I've ever thought about the world. And it's just so challenging. But yeah, I feel like the mob could come to its senses and still we wouldn't get any victories,
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Greg. And I think maybe 2020, the summer of 2020 was the first time where I felt like, okay, there's something really waking up that felt the most pivotal, or the trajectory could be changed the most. And then we saw how the coming to its senses, like what happened to the mob, like what the results were, from police, from unidentified battalions of anonymous soldiers attacking and beating people. So thinking of, just in case, in that case, for people protesting for racial justice, well, if there was a shift to topple the economic system, which benefits a small but an incredibly powerful minority, what will the response be then? That would ultimately lead to restructuring our society. And what do we do? If we're just watching it? I'm going to wait to share my thoughts on that.
That's fine.
Just a bit, because I'm still thinking about it, but I do have something that I want to share, but maybe a little bit later on.
Yeah, and then we have this dazed, numb, powerless, stunned as we frantically click our heels already home. And I love this Wizard of Oz reference here because of how often in my own life I have wished I were somewhere other than where I actually was. You know what I mean? I have these long stretches of my life where I've just been like wishing I was somewhere else, like wishing I was somewhere warmer, wishing I was somewhere sunnier, wishing I was somewhere, et cetera, et cetera. And this like wishing you were somewhere else is, it's common for, I feel like it's a very common reaction when you have this general sense of dissatisfaction about how things are going. It's like that human impulse to kind of run away from your problems. And so I see this line, dazed, numb, powerless, stunned, as we frantically click our heels. It's just like we're realizing this like shitstorm that we're caught in. And it's like we're in the eye of the storm, and like the shitstorm has let up and we're in the eye of it. And it's like we're like dazed and numb, like seeing the storm off in all directions. And we're caught right in the middle of it, and there's no running. So it's like, oh, I wish I was anywhere else. And then the storm hits you again whenever the eye of the storm moves across, So that's kind of what this line reminds me of. Yeah,
it's like Carl Sagan wrote, our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. Like, we're here and that's it. And
so what do we do? The bands, the sports, the booze. And as somebody who drank a lot of White Claw during the pandemic, I can attest that that demon came for me in a very unexpected way. And to me, this is about disengaging from the world in favor of total escapism, as opposed to staying engaged in order to make the world a better place. Because like, once you realize you can't make the world a better place, it's like, well, what do I do now? Well, I might as well just get hammered and watch the Cardinals, For me, this happens often and regularly. I have my kiddo half the time, and every other, and then by the time working my jobs and full-time parenting come to a close and I have time just for myself, I essentially shut down because my brain is at maximum capacity, and I escape into the passivity of Netflix or HBO because I am just totally fried. And like, I don't have the ability at 38 to be endlessly engaged, because being a dad, getting my kid to school, doing my jobs, making the podcast, trying to stay in shape, getting enough sleep, it keeps me so busy to my absolute maximum capacity that when the end of going hard for 5 or 6 days hits me, and I have done zilch to make the world a better place, really, I realize I'm 1 week closer to the end of my life, and I haven't done all that much in this past week that is all that meaningful. And like, it makes me feel small. And then I started drinking White Claw during the pandemic, and then that got very, very dark. And then I, remember binging like 10 seasons in a row of Shameless and like other TV shows and stuff. And the bands, the sports, the booze, it's all that's left of you. It just hits me because I think about my own times in my life when that has absolutely been me, like to the letter, that line in the song.
Yeah. I don't have to worry about the sports part.
Yeah, I don't really either. I don't have any live channels on my TV. So it's like HBO and Netflix. Like, it's just that plasma backlit doom box that just sucks you in, and then before you know it, 4 hours have gone by, and it's like, well, crap, those are 4 hours I'm never getting back, and I'm that much closer to the end. But
but the bands, for me, the amount of money I spent on merchandise and live concerts and records, and even if it's not, supporting artists I care about is a good and meaningful thing, but is it proportionate? Is it balanced? Is there like this counter to something else that I'm also giving to? The amount of time spent just with music when I could also be doing other things as well. it's not only a hobby and an interest and a part of my identity, it is also a distraction. And I mean, there's enough to say that, like, I've not had a drink in over 2 months at this moment. And I think that clarity has allowed me to realize how I have struggled with alcohol, more leaning and depending to cope, either by celebrating or mourning with it, or having a beer, and then it becomes having 3 beers, and it becoming, and not just that part, because I knowing that I drank a unnecessary amount, but never probably like too like alarming, but just consistently enough to probably be not healthy.
Yeah.
But I think like the habit, the interest that became a habit, that became like this, okay, what am I going to find next? And what's the next beer? And how much it preoccupied my attention and my mental and physical energy, when there's just so much more meaningful things happening around the world, to where I'm like caring about where I can find smoked beer, because I love smoked beer and it's hard to find. So then I'm like, well, maybe I'll drive an hour and a half north of Chicago. This place has something, to go in 4 packs, when, I could be volunteering, or I could be reading, or I could be taking that money and putting it towards something, and finding a balance. I'm not giving up alcohol forever, but I've realized that it has been something that has dominated my paycheck, my wallet, my health, my time, in a way that's not sustainable. It's not healthy. It is not, it's not good emotionally, mentally, or physically. And having that time out has been it's a good thing to be honest about, and your support and your honesty about it has also helped with that, to kind of get some distance, to reevaluate, and then come back in and say, like, okay, like, when I feel comfortable, and when I feel like, I won't say I'll have a beer and then I have 4 beers, but just have a beer and just enjoy beer for what it is. And it's just that, and it not, not be coping, and it not replacing something else.
It's very good for your finances too, to no longer buy beer. Like I think I was spending like $25 a week on like cases of White Claw. And like, now I look back on it now and I'm like, man, that is just so dumb. And like, it was like bad for my teeth and bad for my skin. And I would get terrible sleep. And I was just doing it all the time. And I'm like, this is really idiotic.
Why is my acid reflux so bad?
Why am I waking up in the middle of the night feeling like my heart is going to explode, and I'm pouring sweat out of the top of my bald head to where it's like a waterfall? And it's really horrifying. But so anyway, so then we have this next line. After we pull ourselves out of the drunken stupor and go back to note to self, we've got, when the cops and the courts refuse to confess the sins of the few, what is there left to do? The answer is there right before your eyes rise. And like, I love this line about the cops and the courts, because those who have been assigned to protect and to serve us clearly in 2022 are not doing that.
Right.
Like, Keith, I think about this Uvalde shooting all the time, because I stood in my classroom in Missouri for 6 years, waiting to hear gunshots in the hallways in the building that I worked in. Right. And so did my students. My senior year, when Stoneman Douglas happened, my students said to me, we're surprised it hasn't happened here yet. Like, my students said they are waiting for it to happen there. Like, that is the mentality of young people in our society now, that we are so sick that our teenagers are waiting to hear gunshots in school. So I think about those loser cops standing outside that school in Uvalde, Texas, not going inside. And I think about that mom who drove 40 miles from her job, went there, confronted the police, got handcuffed, got unhandcuffed, jumped a fence, went into the school and pulled her own kids out. And then like we have this protect and serve mentality and blue lives matter and blue line banner on flags. And I'm just like, man, that is such a lie. And I think about all the active shooter trainings I have endured as a teacher, where the cops who were given those presentations, like, when I come in there and there's an active shooter, first thing I'm doing is I'm going towards the shooting, and your job is to go in the other direction from the shooting. And I'm like, you think some cop that's going to be like a year away from his pension is going to be running towards gunfire? I think way more cops in our schools than we're willing to admit would be doing exactly what those Uvalde cops were doing and not going towards the gunfire. I think that we have a lot of people out there who are totally underestimating the fact that the Uvalde thing is probably a lot more normal than we would think. And just the stuff recently that came out with the Supreme Court, where just like today, it was announced that it's harder to sue law enforcement officers for abuse. And they're like backing up law enforcement to make it more difficult to hold them accountable for bad actions. That's like today, man. That came out of the Supreme Court like today. So like I'm seeing this Uvalde thing and I'm seeing this Supreme Court thing. And I'm like, wow, there's really nothing of value left, I feel like. And yet, despite all evidence before our very eyes that we live in a kakistocracy, despite the evidence indicating our powerlessness, despite evidence of the oligarchical nature of our uneven power distribution, in even nations that position themselves as being free and fair society, despite evidence that we're headed for global catastrophe, while people with the power to stop it do not act, this song still asks us to rise, which I'm just like, oh my God, I'm so tired now at the end of the song. It's asking me to rise. After I've processed all the things that are that feel irretrievably broken. I have no doubt of Chris's authenticity in this moment. And to me, an important reminder for why I'm being asked to go on is possibly about the context during which this song was written. Was Chris was a relatively new dad at the time, documented in the song Unscripted Moment, elsewhere on the same record. And the fact that his kids are referenced on this record, maybe that's the reason that he's asking us to rise. Like, he's like, oh shit, my kid is going to be alive for the next 80 years. I wonder if this is something that we should continue to try to fight for. So I don't know. That's kind of where I am with the end here.
We've talked a lot about how songs have remained relevant or have gotten even more. And that when the cops and the courts line, that lyric the last few years has come up again and again, wasting lots of time on Twitter. I remember just quote tweeting articles with that single lyric. And it's unfortunate, of course, how relevant it is. And again, I think of something that Hedges wrote. He said, if mechanisms are closed, rebellion is a moral imperative. And we cannot allow resistance to be defined by whether or not we succeed, but what it allows us to become. And, he kind of famously says, I do not fight fascists because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascist. And in my classroom, I spend a lot of time with John Locke's social contract, since it heavily influenced Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. I mean, it's a profoundly logical theory and explanation of governments that, like all groundbreaking ideas, seem, I think, pretty obvious in hindsight. Basically, like, the people give power to governments, and then the government then will protect the rights of the people. And if the government misuses its power, then the people have the ability to replace or overthrow the government. But it's clear now that the social contract is not in play, if it ever was. Like, not only because the government does not reflect the will of the people, nor does it protect their rights, but there is not even an illusion of protection or an illusion of influence from the people. And the government has seized so much power that instituting true progressive democratic reform at this point is probably impossible. I mean, let alone like toppling the government in the first place. So then how do we create change? How do we resist? I thought back to this quote from Frederick Douglass, and I looked back to see, like, did I make reference to this before? So I love this quote. I use it in my classroom all the time. So if I've read this already, I apologize. I tried to look back and I didn't see it, but it might be in there somewhere. But Frederick Douglass wrote, "Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reform. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, all absorbing, and for the time being, putting all other tumults to silence. It must do this or it does nothing. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. Never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you will have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with their either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress."
Keith, can I tweet my way out of that?
Right. Yeah. And the thing is, what we endure now is it's just adding on. It's adding on and adding on. And if there is not pushback, if there is not resistance or struggle, then it will continue. It will endure because people allow it to happen.
Every day I read articles that just to me demonstrate the desperation of human beings. Today I saw that people in New York City are going to their landlords and volunteering to pay higher rent so that the landlord doesn't open up the apartment for rental.
Yeah.
You know, it's insane the amount of desperation that is going on right now in our society. And note to self, man. So I got some YouTube comments here. Geez, what a journey. We have been at this for a long time. So, you know, so I found a couple of YouTube comments. The first 1 minute 45 are a masterpiece of post-apocalyptic rock. Yes. Best propaganda album, bar none, and my favorite album of all time. Is that you? Did I copy and paste you?
It sounds like it. I don't think that's me, but
Okay.
It sounds like it.
I wonder if I found you and I just didn't notice that you post. I feel like I would have recognized if you would have posted that.
Yeah.
Anyway, the Kid in Bad Religion cover Suffer finally reached his destination. That's a good one. Apologetic, always thinking good thoughts. July 2020 is seeing lyrics like these things rise to fruition.
Yeah.
Yikes. After the remaster, someone commented, "I almost forgot this was the best album ever released. Time for another listen." So, Keith, let's bring this in for a landing. You know, I do not want to fully and completely give up hope that the world can theoretically be okay when my time here is up, but holy smokes, the powerlessness I feel in my tiny life is pretty stunning. And recently, as everybody knows, there was a shooting here in Buffalo. But that exact same day, I was at a women's health access rally here in Buffalo, marching in downtown. And the whole time I was in that crowd of people, I kept waiting for somebody in a car to drive their car through the marchers, right? That I kept looking over my shoulder and I was like, man, I feel like a car is going to run through this crowd and kill a bunch of people. That didn't happen while I was at the march, but that exact day of that march, the Tops Market here in Buffalo got shot up by a white supremacist. So this song is, I mean, this is bleak stuff. So this has been a challenging one for me. And I'm relieved that our conversation is over. Just about, but I'm curious about what you're walking away with here, because I ain't walking away with much good other than the fact that it's nice to hang out with you.
Well, I hope I have some parting thoughts that will leave you thinking differently than Greg.
Yeah.
So I think the song, like a lot of Propagandhi's work, embodies the Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci's pretty famous quote, "Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will."
Okay,
right?
that I'm feeling that. I'm feeling
right?
that. Keep going.
Like all signs point toward the worst possible realities and outcomes, but what else can you do other than hope for something better?
Okay.
And like the Frederick Douglass quote I mentioned, and like all of the Chris Hedges quotes, and like the song says, well, you can rise, you can rebel, you can resist. But I think we all know the stakes, the wages, the likelihood, the futility in doing so. So what is left if full-scale revolt is out of the question? And I thought back to something I did in my classroom recently. I collaborated with a professor from Purdue to create a unit on teaching hard history, social emotional learning, analyzing primary and secondary sources, all on the various ways enslaved people resisted their oppression. This is a very long about way to get to my point, but you need some context here.
Yeah.
So my students read excerpts from Dr. Tia Miles, who wrote All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a book about a cloth passed down by an enslaved mother, Rose, to her child, Ashley, when she was sold away at 9. The sack was eventually passed on to Ashley's granddaughter, along with the oral history of the family and the artifact. And Dr. Miles retells the history of slavery and this family working around the gaps in the archives and records to reinterpret resistance, love, survival, kinship, and family, all being meaningful acts of resistance against the system of oppression and racial violence. I highly, highly recommend that book.
That is
All That
amazing.
She Carried. So my students also read excerpts from Dr. Anthony Bogues, who argues that resistance did not only take the shape of violent uprisings. And while those things did happen, the Stono Rebellion, the planned Gabriel's Rebellion, Nat Turner, rebellions did not occur every day. So what were the day-to-day quotidian ways enslaved people resisted? Well, Dr. Bogues argues that they reclaimed their identity and their humanity by forming family bonds, by marrying and holding broom weddings, by planting gardens and managing those physical spaces that fed their families, negotiating less work by feigning injury and working slowly, adapting and evolving religious practices. These small ways enslaved people attempted to reclaim their own conceptions of themselves as human beings that had been denied by their enslavers. So too often, I think the history of enslaved people has been oversimplified as a narrative of history happening to enslaved people or other marginalized communities. It denies them agency, and it perpetuates the notion that they're powerless. And this being like probably a really common criticism amongst the academic historians of Howard Zinn's work. Chris Deutsch brought this up. But the scholarship is that reinterprets and highlights the agency of enslaved people is not only more historically accurate by depicting and reinterpreting oppressed people as having power. I think it's also a reminder for ourselves and a message of hope and inspiration. I made it very clear to tell my students, I am not like saying that your lives are analogous to being enslaved. But ultimately, my point was, like, if I think that I am powerless, why would I do anything? Like, why the hell would I get up in the morning and try to do anything?
Yeah.
It's a defeating, fatalist conclusion to arrive at. And the reality is, I am not as powerful as a CEO or a police officer or a US senator. That the reality is, I'm not as powerful of a person to create all of the change that I want to see in the world. But that doesn't mean I'm powerless. It doesn't mean that I have no influence on the people around me, my family, my community, my students, my classroom. So if I take a lesson from this, that resistance can come in many ways. Like, for this whole system to be overturned, right, that would have to come through this critical mass of people fighting back against what has been codified by law and economic code and the various intersections of racial and economic structures of power within our country. That's probably not going to happen. But that doesn't mean I cannot push back against it and work to challenge it and work to empower the people around me who are greater victims of that system than I am myself. So that's the message of hope that I hope to share with you and everyone else. And that's something I said to my students, and I didn't plan it. It just kind of like was a final takeaway I had at the very end of class. And because I hadn't planned it, I knew, like, that I actually believe that.
Yeah.
It's something that I really believe that I told them. So it wasn't just like an angle to connect the past to the present, to try to make it meaningful or relevant. As I was saying it, I was like, oh yeah, I really think this is true. And I do find inspiration from it. And because the other option is just, throwing your hands up in despair and thinking you can't do anything.
Yeah. And like, I love life, and you and I were both have the goal of raising kind children at the moment. So that's a pretty noble purpose.
And it's an act of resistance. I honestly believe that. Yeah.
Yeah, it is, because a lot of people who are so powerful are not kind and do not like other people. Mm-hmm. And if I wind up with a kind child who does like other people, that is kind of resistance, isn't it? And I love the things that I love in my life, right. And just the simple act of riding a bicycle is wonderful. I do that a lot. And meeting people who like this podcast and listen to us at the shows. I met so many podcast listeners at those shows in Ontario. It was
awesome.
Nuts.
That's really awesome.
And they were like, podcast guy. And I'm like, yeah. And that stuff just makes me smile. So you've convinced me. I am going to bed with a shred of hope that I will cling to forever. And so, yeah, like, to me, this song is super special. Note to Self and Last Will and Testament are special and unique selections in the Propaganda catalog that stand alone as something special and something unique. And it took me a long time to love this song because it isn't a tune like Nation States or Motor League or Failed Imagineer or Humane Meat. It requires an attention span, funnily enough. It requires effort and an attuned ear. So those out there listening who may have grown up loving long songs may think that I'm saying ridiculous things right now, but I come from the short song camp for the most part. So this one really threw me for a loop when it first came out 10 years ago. And this song felt so long, so plodding, so gradual that I probably skipped it and went right into failed states on a lot of early listens. But this song is very unique in comparison to another long intro song like Last Will and Testament. I like this one more than that one. I think Note to Self is better than Last Will and Testament for a lot of reasons. I think this song pays off like crazy when you invest in it, and I'm going to give this one a 5 out of 5.
It is also a 5 for me. Musically, I'll summarize by saying that this is maybe like my friends' dads who are into Rush. I would put this one on to say like, all right, well, not everything I listen to is maybe abrasive or hard to get into, unapproachable. I think musically it's super unique. I love the build. It did take a while to digest, but it's pretty remarkable. Just like Last Will and Testament, we are not powerless, but maybe we have to rethink the power that we have and how we use it. Kind of like in the end of Adventures of Zookosis, it's focusing that power in a different, more controlled or immediate way, in a more local way. So I do think, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So
I love it.
Yeah, it's a 5. It's a 5 for me.
Well, thank you everybody for checking out the podcast. If you want to get in touch, you can find us on Instagram and Twitter at PropagandyPod. You can email us at propagandypod@gmail.com. As you can tell, the podcast these days looks a little different from the early days when we were going super, super hard. We're kind of switching it up and making the show fit into our lives a little bit better these days, which I hope will, lead to us being able to enjoy the show instead of feeling like it is a job, because we do this because we love it. So thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.